Hello, my dear wanderers. It's Soren. Welcome to my first video. Tonight we journey to the wide deserts and quiet plains where stone fortresses wait at the edges of dusty roads. Their walls rise like calm sentinels in the fading light, holding within them courtyards where lanterns flicker and footsteps echo softly across worn stone. We follow the faint wind through arched gates, where travelers rest and stories drift like fabric in the evening air. So before you drift into sleep, take a moment to like and subscribe, only if this brought you calm. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's drift into tonight's journey together. These places weren't hotels with mint on the pillow. No one was fluffing your mattress. Caravanserais were big, stone rectangles, usually with one giant door that looked like it could survive a Mongol siege. Inside, you'd find a courtyard, some little rooms around the edges, maybe a fountain if the architect felt generous. That was it. Minimalist chic, 12th century style. Why did they exist? Because people were dragging silk, spices, porcelain, gold, and let's be honest, a fair number of questionable medicinal herbs across thousands of miles. And desert travel was slow. Think of it like medieval trucking rest stops, except with fewer neon signs and a lot more camel poop. The governments and rulers who built them weren't doing this out of kindness. They wanted trade to keep moving. More trade meant more taxes, more bribes, and naturally more ways to flex power. A shiny caravanserai said, "Look at me, my empire is stable enough that you can nap here without being stabbed in your sleep." A low bar, but impressive in its own way. Now the first major networks of caravans has popped up in Persia under the Sassanid Empire around the 3rd century CE. The Persians were always very into roads, partly for armies, partly for merchants, partly because someone had to carry royal wine shipments before it spoiled. When Islam rose and the Abbasid Caliphate spread, the tradition exploded. Suddenly, you had an entire chain of inns across Iran, Anatolia, and Central Asia, a medieval Marriott, but every location looked like a fortress and probably smelled faintly of horse sweat. Let's float for a moment into the Anatolian plains. The Seljuk Turks in the 11th and 12th centuries were obsessed with caravanserais. They built hundreds, and they didn't just slap up random shacks. Some of these things had mosaics, decorated arches, and inscriptions bragging about which sultan paid for it. Nothing says "sleep well, traveler," like an ominous carved eagle staring at you over the gate. Inside, you'd see merchants unpacking exotic goods. Silk from China, indigo from India, glass from Venice, and then the travelers themselves. They weren't glamorous. Most looked like they'd just survived a sandstorm, because they had Caravanserais, were the one place all these odd characters mixed. Arabs, Persians, Turks, Greeks, Armenians, Mongols. Imagine the accents, imagine the stomach problem. But let's not romanticize too much. These places were also loud, horses braying, chickens running loose, merchants shouting about silk prices, and at least one child crying because his sandal broke. Privacy was not on the menu. Rooms were basically stalls, and if you were low on cash, you probably just curled up in the courtyard next to your camel, which, let's be honest, had better fleas than the bedding. Still, caravans, Averies were lifesavers. Without them, crossing the deserts of Persia or the steppes of Central Asia would have been almost impossible. They were the arteries of long-distance trade, They kept silk flowing west and gold flowing east. They were, in short, the slightly smelly glue holding together a world economy. And speaking of smelly glue, let's drift next into the Persian heartland, where some of the grandest caravanserais still stand. The kind where you could almost mistake it for a palace if you squinted and ignored the camel droppings. So, we've made it past the dusty entry gates of history, and now we're settling in Persia, not modern Tehran, coffee shops and traffic jams. No, the Persia of caravan trails, an endless sun, the land where everyone wanted your saffron and everyone wanted to tax you for it. By the 16th century, when the Safavid dynasty ruled Persia, caravanserais reached their peak. Shah Abbas I, whose hobbies included ruling with an iron fist and commissioning enough architecture to make future tourists grateful, built hundreds of them, not just practical way stations, but showpieces. They were part of his big plan: centralize trade, control routes, and make Isfahan the Paris of its day. Except, with fewer baguettes and more camels. The Safavid caravanserais were architectural flexes. Big courtyards, tall owens, those arched gateways Persians loved, and thick stone walls. You'd ride up after days of blistering desert, your camel smelling like something between a wet blanket and despair, and suddenly, elegant, geometric tile work, symmetrical layouts, and inscriptions reminding you who funded the whole thing. Spoiler, it was always the Shah, and yes, he wanted credit. Now let's not forget why these things mattered so much here. Persia sat smack in the middle of the Silk Road. To the east, China. To the west, the Ottoman Empire and eventually Europe. To the south, India and the spice markets. It was like being the middle stall at the world's busiest bazaar. If you wanted to move silk, porcelain, pepper, or your questionable cousin's rare healing crystals, you probably trudged through Persia, and every step of the way there was a caravanserai waiting. Imagine the scene inside. A long caravan of donkeys lumbers in from the east, jangling with bells, carrying bales of raw silk. From the west, merchants in turbans lead horses loaded with Venetian glassware. From the north, Central Asian traders bring felt, furs, and an unholy number of onions. Everyone stinks. Everyone's cranky. But somehow deals are made. Bartering, shouting, scribbling contracts in cramped handwriting by oil lamp. And later, maybe some music, some storytelling, a bit of wine if the guards weren't looking, because even merchants needed to let off steam. Of course, not everything was trade and tea. Caravanserai were also intelligence hubs. The Persian rulers knew this. Information traveled with caravans faster than official couriers could gallop, so spies, informants, and nosy innkeepers kept ears open. A drunk merchant boasting about an upcoming shipment. The local tax collector would hear about it by morning. Gossip wasn't just gossip, it was statecraft. And then, of course, there were the animals. Caravanserai weren't just for humans. Camels, horses, mules, even the occasional elephant on special missions. Picture the courtyard at night, humans snoring on rough mats while camels chew cud loudly in the corner, probably about as restful as sleeping at an airport gate when your neighbor is blasting TikToks at 3 a.m. Now, while Persia was the glamorous hub, the real wild energy came from Central Asia. The steppes and deserts there stretched for days with nothing but sand, scrub, and the occasional Mongol raid to break the monotony. Caravanserais here were less palaces and more survival bunkers, thick walls, narrow gates, and guard towers. You weren't coming here for the decor. You came because without it, you might become some bandit's dinner. The Mongols, surprisingly, loved Caravanserais. Once they finished conquering half the world in the 13th century, they got very into encouraging trade. After all, you can't tax people if they're dead in the desert. So under the Pax Mongolica, Caravanserais flourished. It was one of those rare moments where being ruled by horse-loving conquerors actually had perks. You could travel from Beijing to Baghdad under a system of rest stops, much like a medieval version of modern highway service plazas. But instead of Starbucks, you got stale bread and lukewarm goat stew. Let's also not forget the more eccentric travelers. Alongside merchants came Sufi mystics, Buddhist monks, Christian missionaries, and the occasional ambitious tourist who thought riding across the desert sounded like fun. Spoiler, it wasn't. They all ended up in Caravanserais, awkwardly trying to mime their needs in a dozen languages. One guy asking for rice, another trying to sell a relic, another insisting his camel deserved a private stall. The innkeeper probably just sighed and wished for early retirement. And while some of these places were grand, others were not. A caravanserai could be a crumbling mud brick rectangle with a courtyard full of fleas and a well that tasted suspiciously like donkey. Merchants didn't have Yelp reviews, but if they did, half the entries would read, 2 stars, water smelled weird, camel got sick, would not stay again. Still, without these hubs, Persia and Central Asia would have been wastelands of broken trade dreams. Caravanserais kept goods moving, kept cultures mixing, and kept at least some people alive long enough to sell overpriced spices in European markets. They were gritty, noisy, and sometimes miserable, but essential. And now that we've had our fill of Persian courtyards and Mongol checkpoints, let's slowly wander down into India, where the caravanserai tradition took on its own peculiar flavors, sometimes literally involving a lot of curry. Alright, so we've crossed Persia, survived the Mongols, and possibly still smell like camel hair. Now we step into India, where the air gets thicker, the food gets spicier, and the caravanserais, well, they pick up their own quirk. India's role in the silk and spice roads was enormous. This was the land of peppercorns, cardamom, cinnamon, indigo, cotton, diamonds. Basically, everything people in Europe claimed they had to have. And with demand came caravans. And with caravans came, of course, caravans, because no matter how exotic the trade goods, humans still needed somewhere to eat questionable stew and complain about the noise. By the medieval period, especially under the Delhi Sultanate and later the Mughal Empire, caravanserai, often just called sarais, dotted the highways. The Mughals were particularly enthusiastic. Akbar the Great, who apparently never saw a tax he didn't like, built a whole network of them across northern India. His logic was simple. Safe merchants is more trade, more revenue, more palaces for him. Practical governance. Mughal addition. These Indian caravanserais were cousins of the Persian style, but with some local flair. Still the big square courtyards, still the fortified walls, still the one imposing entrance. But here you'd also find shady trees, wells with stone steps leading down, and sometimes even mosques or little temples tucked in. Because if you were hauling peppercorns across 500 miles, you might want to pray for survival. One of the more famous examples is along the Grand Trunk Road, that ancient superhighway stretching from Bengal to Afghanistan. It's been in use for over 2 millennia, and by the Mughal era, it was lined with sarais like beads on a necklace. Imagine trudging along in the monsoon season, soaked to the bone, your oxen making squelching noises in the mud, and suddenly spotting one of these fortress inns. Relief. at last. And yes, the food situation was a little better here. In Persia, you probably got hard bread and questionable broth. In India, you might score lentils, rice, maybe some fried dough if the cook was generous. Still not fine dining, but compared to the Central Asian camel stew surprise, it was a step up. And if you were lucky enough to arrive at the same time as a caravan from Bengal, maybe some sweets. Human history, powered by sugar and mild food poisoning. Now, the Mughal rulers weren't just building sarais out of charity. Oh no, they also used them as administrative hubs. Each sarai had keepers, sometimes guards, and usually a scribe who noted who came in and out. These records were not for fun, they were surveillance. The empire wanted to know who was moving goods, who was passing messages, and who might be smuggling things they shouldn't. Caravanserais weren't just inns, they were checkpoints with a side of lentils. And speaking of who showed up, India drew some interesting travelers. Not just merchants, but pilgrims heading to holy sites, wandering Sufi mystics, Jain monks, Hindu ascetics, and the occasional Portuguese trader wondering how he ended up here after leaving Lisbon. You'd find them all crammed together in a sarai courtyard, trying not to step on each other's laundry. Languages collided. Persian, Arabic, Hindi, Turkish, Portuguese. It must have sounded like the world's most chaotic group project. There were also animals, always animals. Camels, horses, donkeys, bullocks, pulling carts, elephants on special occasions. Yes, elephants, because if you were a really fancy merchant or a royal envoy, you might just roll up to the sarai on a decorated elephant. Nothing says unimportant like taking up 3 parking spaces in the courtyard with your giant pet. Now here's a fun detail. In some Mughal sarais, women travelers had their own separate quarters. Not because anyone was being progressive, but because society didn't like the idea of them mixing too much with the merchant riffraff. So behind a discreet wall, there might be rooms just for women, often with extra security. Privacy in a caravanserai, almost unheard of. But occasionally, status brought you a little peace and quiet. And let's not forget the gossip. Oh, the gossip. Caravanserais in India were buzzing hives of rumor. You'd hear about political intrigue in Delhi, battles in Bengal, new taxes in Gujarat, or which royal prince had once again embarrassed himself by losing too much at polo. Merchants loved to complain, and sarai courtyards were basically medieval Twitter, loud, chaotic, and impossible to fact-check. But just like in Persia, not every sarai was luxurious. Some were crumbling mud brick, full of fleas and stray dogs. Others had wells so foul that even the camels refused to drink. Merchants had no TripAdvisor, but if they did, you'd probably see reviews like 1 star, roof leaked, guard stole my shoes. And yet, people kept coming back, because the alternative was camping alone in the wilderness and waking up robbed by bandits, or worse, robbed by mosquitoes. By the late Mughal period, the network stretched across much of India. It was one of the things that actually worked in the empire's messy bureaucracy. Trade flourished, merchants trudged on, and sarias kept doing their job, keeping people alive and vaguely rested. And just as Persia had fed into India, India fed into China, the far eastern end of the Silk Road, which means it's time to shuffle across yet another border into the land of tea, porcelain, and caravanserais that sometimes look suspiciously like monasteries. So, we've survived the peppercorns of India and the onions of Central Asia. Now we drift into China, the far end of the Silk Road, where caravanserais had their own flavor, sometimes literally if you were lucky enough to score dumplings instead of the usual dusty bread. China was the source of the treasures everyone wanted: silk, porcelain, tea, paper, even gunpowder recipes. Though, fun fact, the Chinese weren't exactly keen on giving those away to random merchants. And with great goods came great need for infrastructure. Enter the Caravanserai, or at least the Chinese versions of them. Here, they weren't always called Caravanserais in the Persian sense. Sometimes they were known as post stations or fandayan, guest houses. Built along imperial roads, they worked on the same principle: shelter for travelers, storage for animals, gossip exchange center. Think of them as a hybrid between a government rest stop and a Buddhist monastery with way too many incense sticks. Let's float back to the Tang dynasty. Around the 7th-9th centuries, this was China's big golden age of international trade. The Silk Road was booming. Chang'an, modern Xi'an, was one of the most cosmopolitan cities on earth, and caravans of camels were plodding westward, stacked high with bolts of silk. Along the way, the Tang emperors established official relay stations, part caravanserai, part postal hub, part military check. You'd roll up with your caravan, flash the right documents, and hopefully get a bed and some rice. If you didn't have documents, good luck convincing the stern official that you weren't a spy, because much like in Persia and India, China's caravanserais weren't just hospitality, there was surveillance. The state kept close tabs on who came in, who went out, and whether you were hiding contraband tea bricks under your robe. By the Yuan dynasty, yes, the Mongols again, they never really went away, did they? Caravanserais in China flourished under the Pax Mongolica. The Mongols basically turned Eurasia into a giant open highway system. Marco Polo famously claimed he traveled across them, staying in Chinese inns that ranged from surprisingly grand to questionably sanitary. He described stations with stables, wells, and guards, all designed to keep trade flowing smoothly. Sure, Polo exaggerated a lot, but he wasn't entirely wrong about the network. And here's where things get interesting. In China, some caravans blurred with monasteries and temples. Why? Because Buddhist monks were fantastic at hospitality. They already ran guest houses for pilgrims, so when merchants came through, it was natural to extend the service. Picture a weary Persian trader, covered in dust, sitting cross-legged in a temple courtyard, while a monk gently insists he try vegetarian rice porridge. Probably not what he expected, but better than camel jerky. Of course, not every stay was peaceful. Imagine the language barriers. A Persian merchant asking for hay in broken Chinese, while the local host just nods and serves him tea instead. Misunderstandings were common, but somehow trade still worked. Gold flowed in, silk flowed out, and everyone grumbled about the food portions. One of the unique Chinese twists was the focus on bureaucracy. Every official inn had ledgers, stamps, seals, the full paperwork experience. If Persia's caravanserais were chaotic bazaars, China's were sleepy offices with a side of noodles. You couldn't just show up and flop down. You had to register, state your purpose, maybe bribe the clerk. Human history, powered equally by spices and petty paperwork. And then there was tea. If India had lentils and Persia had flatbread, China's gift to weary merchants was hot tea. Caravanserais here often doubled as tea houses, and weary travelers drank endless cups. Not for relaxation. Caffeine was fuel. You needed it if you planned to drag 20 camels across a mountain pass. Somewhere in there, an exhausted merchant probably muttered, "Without tea, this road is impossible." And honestly, he was right. The gossip here was just as rich as anywhere else. Stories of emperors, rebellions, pirate raids on the coast, plague outbreaks, or which city had the best porcelain. Merchants carried tales like they carried silk. Caravanserais weren't just way stations. They were international newsstands, where you never knew if the rumor was true, but it was always entertaining. Of course, the usual downsides applied. Not every Chinese inn was glorious. Some were little more than wooden shacks with leaky roofs. Others were so crowded that you ended up sleeping wedged between two strangers, one of whom snored like a dying ox. Privacy, none. Sanitation, dubious. Comfort, let's not even pretend. And yet, compared to sleeping outside in a mountain blizzard, even a drafty shack with rat problems sounded like paradise. By the Ming Dynasty, trade routes were shifting, maritime trade was rising, and fewer caravans dragged themselves across the endless deserts. But inland, caravanserais still mattered. Tea, salt, horses, all kept moving, and the network of guest houses remained part of the imperial backbone. So, in China, caravanserais weren't quite the romantic fortress inns of Persia, nor the spice-scented sarais of India. They were more bureaucratic, more structured, sometimes temple-like, still noisy, still crowded, still essential. And now that we've sipped our tea and filled out our paperwork, let's drift into the cultural mashup zones, the places in between, borderlands, crossroads, where caravanserais became strange melting pots of languages, religions, and occasionally very questionable cooking. So far, we've wandered through Persia's palatial courtyards, India's spice-scented sarais, and China's paperwork-heavy guest houses. But some of the most interesting caravans weren't in the big centers at all. They were in the borderland, those strange in-between places where languages tangled, religions overlapped, and merchants swapped more gossip than goods. Take Central Asia again, but this time, not the Mongol highways, just the random outposts between empires. One moment you might be on Persian territory, the next under Turkic Khans, and the next, well, who really knew? Borders were vague, rulers changed monthly, and caravanserais were the only constants. Imagine trudging up to one of these dusty forts, not even sure which flag would be flying over the gate that week. Surprise governance. Everyone's favorite. Inside, the scene was almost comical. A Persian trader trying to haggle in broken Turkish, a Buddhist monk chanting in the corner, a Christian missionary awkwardly offering pamphlets nobody could read, and an Armenian merchant swearing that his carpets were better than everyone else's, because of course he was. It was like a medieval international airport lounge, except instead of free Wi-Fi, you got fleas. Food was another mixed bag, literally. Caravanserai kitchens, cooked with whatever they had, sometimes rice, sometimes bread, sometimes meat so dubious that even the dogs looked suspicious. In some spots, dried yogurt balls were the staple. Yes, hard little balls of sour milk, rehydrated in water, delicious. Not really. Nutritious, questionably. But if you were starving after a week in the desert, you weren't complaining, at least not loudly. One thing caravanserais excelled at, no matter where they were, was serving as rumor mills. Think of them as medieval news feeds. Want to know if the Byzantines were fighting again? Ask the merchant who came from Anatolia yesterday. Wondering if a plague had broken out in Samarkand, someone in the courtyard had probably already started a conspiracy theory about it. Rumors spread faster than camels could walk, which was impressive, since camels walked everywhere. And let's not forget the travelers themselves. Caravanserais were magnets for oddballs. Sure, there were the serious silk merchants and spice traders, but also wandering mystics who claimed they could levitate, failed alchemists trying to sell miracle potions, and amateur explorers who thought trudging into deserts was a good life choice. Every courtyard was a mix of tired pragmatists and eccentric dreamers. A historian once called them universities of the road, which is just a poetic way of saying loud, crowded dorms with no showers. Some caravanserais even doubled as little markets. Merchants didn't always wait to reach a big city to sell. If they were desperate or bored, they just set up shop in the courtyard. Picture it, a man shouting about fine silk while a camel loudly interrupts him with a sneeze. Bargains struck over piles of dates, bolts of cloth, or if you were unlucky, bags of salt that look suspiciously like sand, and the entertainment. Surprisingly lively, travelers told stories, recited poetry, sang songs, maybe even played instruments if they hadn't been smashed by baggage handlers, aka other merchants. Some caravans even had attached bathhouses, which were less luxury spa and more lukewarm communal tub where you hoped the water wasn't too green. Still, it was a welcome change after weeks of dust. Of course, security was always on everyone's mind. Caravanserais often had thick gates locked at night. Guards patrolled the walls, making sure no one slipped in to rob the courtyard. But sometimes, the guards themselves were the thieves. More than one merchant probably woke up to find his saddlebags mysteriously lighter, while the guard just shrugged and claimed ignorance. It's human history, a long chain of misplaced wallets. Then there was the paperwork. Oh yes, the dreaded ledgers. Many caravanserais, especially in border zones, required registration. Who are you? What are you carrying? Where are you headed? The idea was to prevent smuggling and tax evasion. The reality was usually a clerk with bad handwriting and a bribe jar sitting right on his desk. Want to skip the inspection, slip him a coin. Bureaucracy, timeless, universal, and mildly corrupt. And yet, despite the chaos, caravanserais worked. Goods moved, cultures mingled, languages blended. A Persian word might end up in Turkish, which ended up in Hindi, which ended up in some Venetian merchant's notebook. Without caravanserais, the silk and spice roads would have been disconnected trails. With them, they became arteries of global exchange, arteries with heartburn, fleas, and bad stew, but arteries nonetheless. By now, you can probably feel the world shifting. Because just as these caravanserais were peaking, new trade routes were rising. Ships were starting to replace camels. Ports were replacing courtyards. And slowly the great desert inns began to fade, which is where we'll wander next, into their long, slow decline. By now we've wandered from Persia to India to China, stopping at every slightly smelly courtyard along the way. But nothing lasts forever, not dynasties, not trade routes, and definitely not inns that relied on a constant stream of cranky merchants. The caravanserais, those fortress hotels of the silk and spice roads, eventually faced a problem they couldn't fix with lentils and gossip, the sea. The late 15th and 16th centuries saw Europe suddenly rediscovering that boats exist, and not just little coastal boats, big, ocean-crossing caravels and galleons. Portugal, Spain, the Dutch, the English, all started sailing straight to India and China. Why trudge for months across deserts, risking bandits, fleas, and bureaucratic clerks with bad attitudes, when you could cram a ship full of peppercorns and sail back in a fraction of the time? The result? Land-based trade routes and their beloved caravanserais started drying up, slowly, like a well in the desert. Merchants still traveled, of course, but the volume shifted. Fewer caravans, fewer camels, fewer reasons to maintain a giant stone inn in the middle of nowhere. Imagine running a motel off an abandoned highway. Not much business once everyone takes the bypass. Some rulers tried to fight back. Safavid Persia, for example, kept investing in caravanserais. Well into the 17th century, building them like architectural trophies. Shah Abbas I's network was still impressive, but even he couldn't outcompete Portuguese ships hauling pepper straight from Goa. You can have the prettiest courtyard in the world, but if no one's showing up, it doesn't matter. The Ottomans, too, with their vast empire straddling trade routes, tried to keep caravanserais alive. In Anatolia and the Balkans, you still find these big hulking buildings that look like someone forgot to finish a castle. They served merchants well into the 18th century, but by then caravans were more regional, moving grain, wool, maybe local timber. The big-ticket global trade was sailing right past them on the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean. And then came the Europeans with their colonial trading companies, the Portuguese Estado da Índia, the Dutch East India Company, the British East India Company, all obsessed with shipping. They poured resources into ports. Goa, Batavia, Calcutta, Canton, harbours became the new caravanserais. Instead of camels, you had warehouses. Instead of dusty courtyards, you had customs offices. And instead of gossip under the stars, you had sailors yelling shanties while throwing barrels of nutmeg overboard. Progress, I guess. By the 19th century, caravanserais were shadows of their former selves. Some were abandoned entirely, crumbling into ruins, where shepherds kept goats. Others were repurposed, turned into village squares, military barracks, or just really awkward-looking storage sheds. A few stubbornly survived as regional inns, but the grand days of international caravans were gone. Travelers of the time noticed the change. European explorers, ever fond of writing long, self-important journals, often stumbled across half-empty caravanserais. They described cracked walls, silent courtyards, and caretakers who looked like they hadn't seen a paying guest in weeks. The romance of the Silk Road was already a ghost story, and yet the legacy lingered. Caravanserais had shaped centuries of trade, connected continents, and kept entire empires afloat with tax revenue. Even when the ships took over, the memory stuck. You could say they became cultural fossils, reminders of a time when the world economy moved at the speed of a camel. Some were lucky enough to be restored. In Turkey, Iran, and Central Asia, a few caravanserais still stand, polished up for tourists. You can walk through their courtyards, admire the arches, and try to imagine the noise of 100 merchants arguing over silk prices. It's strangely calming to know that once this was the beating heart of global trade, and now it's just a quiet stone square where someone sells postcards. The decline wasn't dramatic. There wasn't a single moment when caravanserais died. They just faded. One fewer caravan, one empty courtyard, one innkeeper quietly shutting the doors because no one came anymore. History often ends not with a bang, but with a whimper, or in this case, with a very tired camel sighing in the desert. And that brings us to the last stretch of our sleepy journey, the reflections. The why this mattered and what remains today part, where we take the long view and let the camels finally rest. So here we are, at the end of the road. We've trudged from Persia's fortress inns to India's spice-scented sarais, from China's bureaucratic guest houses to the chaotic crossroads where everyone argued about onions. We've seen merchants, mystics, monks, missionaries, and more camels than anyone should ever smell in one lifetime. And now, the Caravanserais themselves have faded into ruins, but their stories are still very much alive. Think of what they were: simple courtyards. Really, walls, a gate, a few rooms, a well, nothing flashy, unless you were lucky enough to stumble into one of Shah Abbas's architectural flexes. And yet, these humble structures kept the world connected. Without them, the Silk Road might have been a scattered dream. With them, goods moved, cultures met, and rumors spread faster than any official courier could manage. Caravanserais weren't glamorous. They were noisy, smelly, crowded, and occasionally dangerous. You were as likely to get fleas as you were to get a hot meal. And yet, they were lifeline. They gave shelter where there was none, community where there was only sand, and continuity where borders shifted like dunes. They were, in their own dusty way, the beating hearts of global trade. Today, most are silent. Some stand as restored monuments, polished up with ticket counters and gift shops, ready for tourists who want to imagine the romance of the Silk Road without enduring the camel fleas. Others are just ruins, half swallowed by sand, their courtyards echoing only with wind. If you stumble across one in Iran or Turkey or Uzbekistan, you can almost hear the ghosts of caravans settling in for the night. Merchants haggling, camels groaning, and some tired clerk muttering about missing paperwork. Their legacy is quieter, but still there. The idea of the roadside inn, the highway rest stop, the place where weary travelers gather. It hasn't really gone away. Today, it's just gas stations, motels, and service plazas instead of stone courtyard. Less exotic, maybe, but the principle is the same. Humans still need places to pause, recharge, and share questionable food with strangers. And just like that, this story closes. But our journey isn't over. The past is full of hidden corners, and the next one is waiting just ahead. Let's lean in and drift into something new. This is the shadowed halls of Knossos, echoes of the Minoan Labyrinth. The ruins of Knossos rest on a hill in Crete, partly reconstructed with concrete and imagination, and partly crumbling back into the soil. Archaeologists call it a palace, though palace is a generous word. It was more like a sprawling complex, half ceremonial stage, half administrative hub, with staircases leading in odd directions, and courtyards that do not quite match their neighbors. People visiting today sometimes wander through it in a daze, as though they have stepped into a dream designed by someone who had more enthusiasm for corridors than for logic. If you tilt your head just right, you can almost see why people once whispered about Labyrinth. The Minoans, as they are called, left their mark on the island around 4,000 years ago. They flourished in the Bronze Age, long before Athens or Sparta had their glory. The name Minoan is modern, borrowed from the mythical King Minos, whose family drama with a bull and a half-human offspring became a permanent piece of Greek storytelling. Scholars have reminded us more than once that there is no hard evidence of a labyrinth underground, nor a monstrous hybrid pacing its halls. Still, when you walk through Knossos, with its overlapping rooms and twisting stairways, you can forgive earlier visitors for leaning into the legend. It feels like a place where you could lose your way and never return, especially if you had the poor fortune of a flickering oil lamp. At the heart of Knossos lies the Grand Staircase, reconstructed in the early 20th century by Sir Arthur Evans, the British archaeologist who uncovered the site. Evans was enthusiastic to the point of restlessness. He poured cement to rebuild walls. He painted bright frescoes with a modern hand, and he often guessed at what a room might have been used for. He believed he was bringing the Minoans back to life. Critics later called it heavy-handed meddling. Either way, he ensured that the Palace of Knossos became one of the most famous archaeological sites in Europe. It is partly history, partly a man's early 1900s interpretation of history, and altogether a setting that feels haunted by what we can never fully recover. The frescoes show scenes of bull leaping, where acrobats performed improbable flips over massive animals. The images of blue dolphins swimming across plaster walls remind visitors that the Minoans adored the sea. They were seafarers, traders, and perhaps gentle show-offs when it came to painting fish. What they did not leave behind, unfortunately, was much in the way of written explanation. Their script, called Linear A, remains undeciphered. Later, the Greeks used a related script called Linear B, which scholars eventually cracked and recognized as early Greek. Linear A, though, sits stubbornly outside our understanding. Every tablet or inscription is a puzzle that scholars can only stare at. So when we try to know the Minoans, we mostly look at their architecture, their art, and the leftovers of daily life, piecing together guesses like archaeologists playing charades. The palace complex stretched out with storerooms that once held large clay jars called pithoi. These jars were wide enough for a person to crouch inside, though ideally they held olive oil, wine, or grain. The sheer number of them suggests a society that enjoyed storing things in bulk, which is always a sign of ambition and administration. Control the food, and you control the people, a principle as old as civilization itself. Knossos had dozens of these storage rooms, which made Evans believe the place was the center of a centralized economy. He described the Minoans as peaceful, orderly, and prosperous, a kind of utopian society that left behind beautiful art and relatively few signs of war. Later archaeologists pointed out that he might have been seeing what he wanted to see. After all, walls do not always tell the full story. The name Labyrinth, often linked with Knossos, probably came from the word labyrinth, meaning double axe. The double axe symbol appears often in Minoan art and carvings. It may have been a ritual object, or simply a symbol of authority. Over time, stories spun around it, suggesting a labyrinth beneath the palace. The Greeks, with their love of weaving myth around memory, imagined Theseus stalking through the twisting corridors, guided by Ariadne's thread, hunting down the Minotaur. In reality, no underground maze has been found. What exists is above ground, room upon room, level upon level, in a design that already feels like a puzzle without needing to add a monster. Still, there is something strangely fitting about the palace holding both history and myth in its walls. The Minoans did not survive into the classical Greek world as a living civilization. They vanished, absorbed into later cultures, or dissolved by natural disaster. Volcanic eruptions on the nearby island of Thera, now called Santorini, probably devastated their trade routes. Earthquakes rattled Crete itself. Fires swept through parts of Knossos, more than one. By the time the Mycenaeans from mainland Greece began using the site, the old Minoan world was already in decline. The stories that followed, the Minotaur, the Labyrinth, may have been the only way their memory survived in popular imagination. Walking through Knossos today, you encounter reconstructed throne rooms, although the throne itself is more like a modest stone chair. It does not look especially comfortable, but perhaps comfort was not the point. Authority often prefers stiff seating. The throne room also features a fresco of griffins, creatures half lion, half eagle, painted in bright colors. They stare outward with calm indifference, as though unimpressed by centuries of human curiosity. Knossos was not the only palace on Crete. Sites like Phaistos, Melia, and Zakros also reveal the Minoan flair for architecture and storage. But Knossos remains the largest, the one most tangled with myth. It sprawls over several acres, more than enough to overwhelm a visitor. Staircases lead both upward and downward, some ending abruptly, others curling back to the start. Light wells cut into the structure to bring in sunlight, casting dramatic shadows that must have seemed magical in the Bronze Age. The sense of complexity was intentional. These were not people who valued simple, rectangular houses. They preferred intricacy, even if it confused their descendants. One of the more curious aspects of Knossos is the plumbing. The Minoans had clay pipes that carried water, even flushing toilets of a sort. This was the Bronze Age, yet they managed features that some parts of Europe would not see again until centuries later. It is easy to imagine Evans walking through, nodding to himself, and congratulating the ancients on their forward thinking. Civilizations are often judged by their bathrooms, and by that measure the Minoans rank rather high. Of course, grandeur has a fragile side. The palace was destroyed and rebuilt more than once. Fires blackened walls, earthquakes cracked foundations. People patched and reconstructed, trying to maintain their central hub. Each rebuilding left layers for modern archaeologists to peel back, like strata of ambition and disaster. Some layers contain ashes, silent witnesses to catastrophe. Others reveal hastily patched walls, the architectural equivalent of a sigh. The palace may have been administrative, religious, and symbolic, all at once. There is evidence of ritual activity, with soul shrines and altars scattered through the complex. Frescoes show processions, dances, and sacred symbols. Bulls appear again and again, not just in leaping scenes, but also as horns carved into stone, known as horns of consecration. It is tempting to imagine ceremonies where the community gathered, music echoing through the halls, torches flickering, priests and priestesses moving in rhythm, but these images remain just that, imaginations based on art and architecture. The reality may have been more mundane, or stranger, in ways we cannot grasp. Evans saw the Minoans as refined and gentle, contrasting them with the supposedly more warlike Mycenaeans. He liked the idea of an advanced society that celebrated beauty, art, and ceremony without the shadow of constant battle. Later scholars found signs of fortification and conflict, suggesting his vision was more romantic than realistic. Still, there is something compelling in the idea of a people who decorated walls with dolphins rather than endless battle scenes. Even if the truth was somewhere in between, the impression lingers. The story of Knossos is not only about its Bronze Age inhabitants, but also about its rediscovery. When Evans began excavating in the early 1900s, he was swept up in excitement. He gave names to rooms: the throne room, the Queen's Megaron, the Hall of the Double Axes, that may or may not match their actual use. His reconstructions, painted and plastered, reflected both the ancient past and the Edwardian present. Visitors since then have often struggled to separate one from the other. The palace is both ancient ruin and modern imagination, blended together in a way that is difficult to untangle. If you drift slowly through these halls in your mind, you may picture the flicker of torchlight against painted walls, You may hear the echo of footsteps on stone, the shuffle of sandals, the low murmur of voices gathering for ceremony. And like a slide into another age, you notice the silence of ruin, the absence of answers, the weight of centuries that have blurred details into mystery. Knossos remains both shadowed and luminous, a labyrinth of history itself, and so the palace lingers, not as a puzzle solved, but as one that continues to draw us in with its winding passages and unanswered questions, drifting onward into the dim corners of interpretation, where historians fumble with fragments and wonder what daily life might have felt like inside this palace city. Knossos was not a place of a single ruler sitting alone on a stone chair, even if the so-called throne room tries to sell that idea. Instead, it was a hive, full of scribes tallying jars of olive oil, servants carrying amphorae through crowded corridors, artisans painting dolphins or bulls in bright red and blue, and religious officials maintaining rituals whose meanings are now lost. Imagine walking through the air thick with the scent of burning incense, oil lamps smoking slightly, and the low rustle of activity echoing in stone chambers. The past may be quiet to us, but in its own time, Knossos was anything but. The society that maintained this elaborate complex must have been equally elaborate. The Minoans were not an isolated island people. Their ships carried goods across the Aegean and into the wider Mediterranean. They traded pottery with Egypt, exchanged goods with the Near East, and absorbed influences from all corners. Archaeologists find Minoan artifacts scattered far from Crete, evidence that their seafaring reach was broad. They were not shy about style either. Frescoes from places like Akrotiri on Santorini show striking similarities to Cretan art, as if the Minoan aesthetic was fashionable abroad. One might say they exported both goods and taste, like an early Bronze Age design brand, but taste alone does not run a palace. The system behind Knossos must have been tightly organized. Each wing seems to have had its purpose: magazines for storage, workshops for craftsmen, ceremonial spaces for gathering. Large central courtyards suggest communal events, whether religious, political, or social. Imagine hundreds of people gathered in one of those open spaces, the sound of flutes drifting across the air, dancers circling in rhythm, and the looming bulk of the palace rising around them like an amphitheater. It would have been both impressive and intimidating, which was probably the point. Then again, human life is rarely all ceremony. For every grand procession, there were surely moments of everyday routine: grinding grain, fetching water, repairing pottery. Children must have darted through corridors, though no fresco ever shows them tripping over amphorae or annoying their parents. Servants probably sighed when pithoi cracked, and scribes may have grumbled about tallying another list of jars. These smaller moments never made it onto the walls, yet they filled the days just as much as bull-leaping spectacles. A palace is glamorous in hindsight, but in the moment it is also just a workplace, albeit one designed with more flair than most. The bull-leaping scenes remain the most famous part of Minoan imagery. Young acrobats are shown vaulting over massive bulls, grabbing horns, flipping bodies in ways that make modern athletes wince. Whether this was literal sport, symbolic ritual, or a stylized fantasy is still debated. Some scholars lean toward the ceremonial side, imagining that it was less about athletic competition and more about representing human control over chaos. Others think it might have been closer to actual performance, perhaps with less deadly bulls than the images suggest. Either way, the bulls dominate the imagery of Knossos, larger than life, embodying both danger and fascination. The fascination with animals was not limited to bulls. Dolphins swam across frescoes, Griffins adorned ceremonial spaces, and serpents wound through religious imagery. The famous snake goddess figurines, with their uplifted arms and wide-eyed stares, show women holding snakes as though they were extensions of sacred power. Evans loved these figures, interpreting them as evidence of a matriarchal society. Later scholars cooled his enthusiasm, pointing out that while women are certainly prominent in Minoan art, the actual social structure is harder to pin down. Still, the image of a snake goddess lingers in museum displays, as if daring visitors to decide what she represents. Religion at Knossos was likely centered around nature. Sacred caves, peak sanctuaries on mountains, and tree shrines all suggest a world where divinity was tied to the land itself. Inside the palace, horns of consecration, altars, and ritual vessels point to ceremonies both public and private. Offerings may have included animals, though evidence for human sacrifice remains contested and thin. What we can say is that ritual permeated the architecture, weaving the divine into daily administration. To live in Knossos was to live with ceremony at every turn, as if the sacred and the practical shared the same walls. The palace also reveals the Minoan fascination with light and shadow. Light wells allowed sunlight to penetrate deep into the structure, creating a play of brightness and gloom. In a society that valued ritual, this must have carried meaning. Sunlight catching on painted walls, shadows stretching through corridors. It would have created a shifting atmosphere where the mundane could easily slip into the mystical. Even now, walking through ruins, the changes in light feel dramatic, as if the building was designed to keep visitors slightly off balance, unsure where the next turn might lead. One of the ironies of Knossos is that its fame rests as much on its destruction as on its life. Around 1450 BCE, many Minoan sites suffered catastrophic damage. The eruption of Thera decades earlier may have weakened their system by disrupting trade and triggering tsunamis. Earthquakes shook Crete, often enough to bring down walls. Fires swept through the palace, leaving blackened debris by the time the dust settled. The Mycenaeans from mainland Greece had moved in, leaving their mark on the ruins. They adopted the site, repurposed rooms, and wrote in Linear B instead of Linear A. The shift is visible in the archaeological record, a reminder that even great labyrinths cannot resist change. The decline of Knossos did not erase it from memory entirely. Greek mythmakers later wove its shadows into tales of Minos, Daedalus, Ariadne, and Theseus. It is difficult to know how much of that myth preserved in memories of the Minoan past, and how much was simply invention layered over ruins, but the labyrinth stuck, a metaphor too good to let go. A twisting palace with uncertain rooms naturally lent itself to a story about being trapped and guided only by a thread. It is almost poetic that the undeciphered Linear A script keeps us trapped in our own scholarly labyrinth, circling walls of text we cannot read. Modern visitors may feel a similar tangle. You walk through reconstructions, some painted in bold colors, others left as bare stone. You pass Evans' cement staircases, and then stumble into genuine Bronze Age floors. You are never entirely sure where the ancient stops and the modern imagination begins. The site is a hybrid, half ruin, half vision. This too is a kind of labyrinth, not of walls but of interpretations. Every turn leaves you wondering if you are still in history or already in speculation. Even with its uncertainties, Knossos offers glimpses of a society remarkably advanced for its time. The plumbing alone feels like a minor miracle, with clay pipes channeling water through the palace, bathrooms with flushing systems, suggest a concern for hygiene that would impress later civilizations. Drainage channels carried away rainwater, sparing residents the joyless experience of flooded corridors. These details remind us that for all the mystery of frescoes and rituals, life also involved practical matters. A civilization that can manage its bathrooms is often one that can manage itself. The storerooms, with their towering pithai, also reveal a society thinking ahead. To fill those jars required surplus production, which required organized agriculture, which in turn required administrative oversight. Someone had to count, someone had to distribute, and someone had to enforce the system. The palace was not only about ceremony, it was about control. Even if Evan's rosy vision of a peaceful utopia was exaggerated, the efficiency of Knossos was real. Control the olive oil, and you control Crete. And yet, for all its efficiency, Knossos collapsed. Civilizations often do, whether through natural disaster, external invasion, or internal strain. The system eventually faltered. The fires that swept through the palace left walls charred, frescoes broken, and storerooms emptied. What survived was fragmentary, enough to intrigue, but not enough to explain. In some ways, the mystery is more enduring than any clear answer would have been. Solved puzzle is quickly forgotten. An unsolved labyrinth lingers. As you drift further into this history, you may notice how silence fills the gaps. No voices from Knossos tell us their stories. No linear A tablets offer us translations. We have walls, jars, paintings, and ruins. We have Evans's imagination layered on top, and we have myths spun centuries later that tried to remember something that was already gone. In this silence, the palace becomes almost dreamlike, a structure you walk through in your sleep, where corridors shift, frescoes flicker, and the thread you follow leads you nowhere certain. And so, step by step, the halls of Knossos stretch onward, their echoes mingling with the myths that clung to them. As the labyrinth drifts ever deeper into the fog of later memory, where myth and archaeology blur into a single tapestry. For the ancient Greeks of the classical era, Knossos was less a real ruin and more a stage for legends. King Minos, son of Zeus and Europa, supposedly ruled here, ordering Daedalus to design a labyrinth to imprison the monstrous Minotaur. Theseus, the heroic visitor from Athens, arrived to slay the beast, guided by Ariadne's thread. It is a story stitched into countless retellings, a parable of courage and cunning, and perhaps also of Athens, making itself the center of the universe. Even in tales set in Crete, the irony is that while these myths are endlessly retold, the actual people of Knossos left us almost nothing we can directly read. Linear A remains silent. No heroic boasts, no royal decrees, no epic poems scratched onto tablets. What survives are lists, mostly inventories of goods, recorded in later Linear B by Mycenaeans. It is as if the palace tried to speak, but the sentences collapsed into account books, a grand labyrinth remembered for its jars of olive oil. It makes you wonder what future archaeologists will find of us, perhaps spreadsheets outlasting novels. Still, the myth of Minos tells us something about how later Greeks viewed Crete. They imagined Minos as those lawgiver and tyrant, a ruler who demanded tribute from Athens in the form of youth sent into the labyrinth. To a Greek audience, this story dramatized power dynamics, Crete as overlord, Athens as victim, and Theseus as liberator. Whether any of that reflected real Bronze Age politics is another matter. The story may have been little more than propaganda dressed up as myth, an origin tale explaining why Athens deserved to lead the Greek world. Daedalus, the legendary craftsman, also belongs to this Cretan web of stories. He was said to have built the labyrinth itself, an invention so cunning that even he barely escaped. Later, he fled Crete with his son Icarus, whose wax wings melted when he flew too close to the sun. Again, the story turns Crete into a stage, the backdrop for cautionary tales about ambition and its consequences. The real builders of Knossos, with their careful staircases and light wells, remain anonymous. Instead, Daedalus carries the credit, because myth often prefers a single name to 1,000 forgotten craftsmen. As myths grew, so did misunderstandings. The labyrinth became an underground maze in later retellings. Though the palace itself sits squarely above ground, the Minotaur became a symbol of monstrous appetite, though in earlier versions it may have represented something more complex, perhaps a garbled memory of bull rituals or a metaphor for chaotic forces subdued by order. Scholars can debate endlessly, but the truth is lost in the swirl of centuries. The labyrinth is less about fact than about how humans remember twisting, doubling back, inventing exits where none existed.
Meanwhile, the ruins of Knossos themselves slumbered for centuries, buried under soil and olive groves. Locals knew of the site, of course, but it was not until Evans arrived in 1900 that large-scale excavation began. His enthusiasm reshaped the way the world imagined the Minoans. He described them as a peaceful, artistic people, led by priest-kings or perhaps even priest-queens, living in harmony on their island paradise. It was a flattering picture, well suited to the romantic spirit of the time. It also conveniently contrasted with the warlike Mycenaeans, allowing Evans to paint a tale of innocence lost to aggression. History rarely behaves so neatly, but neatness is appealing when writing books for eager readers.
One of the curiosities of Evans's work is his reconstruction of the Queen's Megaron, a chamber decorated with frescoes of dolphins leaping across blue seas. He imagined it as the private quarters of a royal woman, possibly a queen, surrounded by attendants. The dolphin fresco itself is largely a modern reconstruction, pieced together from fragments. Visitors often admire it as if it were intact, forgetting that what they see is partly a 20th century painting inspired by ancient fragments. It is beautiful, yes, but it is also a collaboration between the Bronze Age and Edwardian imagination. In that sense, the palace remains a labyrinth of authenticity, where you never quite know if you are looking at the ancient or the modern. The throne room is another of Evans's inventions. He identified a stone chair as the throne of King Minos, though it might equally have been a seat for a priestess or symbolic figure. The griffin frescoes surrounding it were restored with a generous hand. The room itself may never have served as a royal audience chamber, yet visitors walk through it with hushed reverence, as though they have stepped into the court of Minos himself. This is the strange power of reconstruction. It guides imagination even when the evidence is thin. The Mycenaeans, from the Greek mainland, eventually took control of Knossos. Their presence is visible in the adoption of Linear B, a script that records early Greek language. With it come records of rations, allocations, and inventories, lists of sheep, jars of oil, and grain distributions. The bureaucratic tone feels far removed from dolphin frescoes or snake goddess figurines, where the Minoans left art that celebrated life and nature. The Mycenaeans left accounting records. It is not that one was more advanced than the other, but that priorities had shifted. Knossos became a site of administration under new rulers, its labyrinthine halls echoing with different voices. Even so, traces of Minoan culture lingered. Mycenaean frescoes continued to echo Minoan themes, and rituals adapted old symbols. Cultural absorption is rarely a clean break. More often, conquerors adopt what they find appealing and blend it with their own practices. By the time Knossos finally fell into ruin around 100 BCE, its legacy had already merged into the broader fabric of Greek prehistory. The Minoans themselves may have faded, but their echoes survived, reshaped in myth and memory. Centuries later, when Greeks told the story of the Labyrinth, they were not just inventing a monster. They were grappling with the ruins of a civilization they did not fully understand. To them, the vast palace with its endless corridors must have seemed uncanny. It was too large, too complex, too strange. How better to explain it than with a tale of a maze and a monster? Theseus's thread was a story's way of finding a path through confusion. In reality, archaeologists have spent over a century trying to follow the same thread, wandering through ruins, fragments, and undeciphered scripts. The labyrinth is not underground, it is historical. The enduring mystery of Knossos lies not only in what we know, but in what remains hidden. Every new excavation uncovers fragments, yet never a full picture. Frescoes break off halfway, tablets crumble at the edges, and artifacts emerge without context. Each discovery offers a glimpse and then stops, leaving us to guess at the rest. It is like being given pieces of a puzzle with most of the center missing. We can arrange the border, admire the fragments of dolphins or bulls, but the heart remains blank. That blankness is its own kind of labyrinth, where scholars circle endlessly, debating paths that may lead nowhere. If you let your thoughts drift through the ruins, you might picture them not as silent stone, but as a layered memory. First, the Bronze Age bustle of officials, dancers, priests, and children. Then the silence of centuries as walls collapsed and weeds grew. Then the sudden noise of Evans's workmen, pickaxes clanging, cement poured, frescoes painted anew. And finally, the steady shuffle of modern tourists, cameras flashing, guides gesturing, voices echoing in a dozen languages. Knossos has never really stopped being busy. It has simply changed tenants, from Minoans to Mycenaeans, to archaeologists to tourists. Each group leaves its trace, another passage in the labyrinth. And as you linger in this drifting maze of memory, the palace stretches further, twisting into yet more corridors of uncertainty, leading ever deeper into the contradictions of a civilization remembered partly through admiration and partly through absence. The deeper archaeologists dig into Knossos, the more it seems like a stage set where some actors have vanished, leaving only props and half-finished lines. We see grand staircases leading nowhere, storerooms filled with broken pithoi, fragments of frescoes, with just enough detail to hint at their brilliance, but never quite enough to tell the whole story. It is as if time deliberately edited the record, removing context while leaving just enough spectacle to keep us fascinated. Consider the snake goddess figurines again. They stand with raised arms, clutching serpents, their wide eyes frozen in ceramic intensity. Evans saw in them a symbol of female power, a priestess or goddess embodying fertility and control over nature. Later scholars suggested they might not represent divinity at all, but could be ritual participants, even toys or decorative objects. The lack of clear evidence means we are left circling interpretations. Much like a thread winding through a labyrinth, every time we think we know what they mean. Another scholar points out an alternative. The figurines, like much of Minoan culture, refuse to sit still in a single explanation. Religion at Knossos, for feels both accessible and opaque. The frescoes and artifacts show us horns of consecration, altars and processions. We know rituals happened. We know symbols mattered, but we cannot step into the ceremonies themselves. Were they blood sacrifices, symbolic offerings, or something gentler? Were processions solemn acts of devotion, or elaborate performances for public spectacle? The fragments offer no clear answer. In the absence of certainty, we drift into speculation, each theory another corridor of the labyrinth. The architectural design of the palace itself encourages this sense of disorientation. Rooms open into other rooms without clear hierarchy. Corridors twist, double back, and sometimes end abruptly. Even Evans admitted that he often lost his sense of direction during excavation. The palace does not behave like the tidy floor plans of later Greek or Roman buildings. Instead, it sprawls organically, as though designed by someone who enjoyed puzzles. Perhaps this was intentional, a way to create awe and confusion for visitors. To step into Knossos may have been to submit to its design, to be swallowed by its halls. Authority can express itself in many ways, and at Knossos it may have spoken through architecture. This disorientation also raises questions about governance. Who actually ruled here? The throne room suggests authority, but whether it belonged to a king, queen, or priesthood is uncertain. Evans preferred the idea of a king, aligning with the myth of Minos. Later interpretations emphasized female figures, imagining priestesses or queens at the center. Still others argue for a more collective form of rule, with administrators and priests sharing power. The absence of clear royal inscriptions, so common in Egypt or Mesopotamia, leaves us without a definitive answer. Perhaps that silence itself is telling. The Minoans may not have needed their rulers to be immortalized in stone, or perhaps their records are simply lost, leaving us to guess forever. The economic side of Knossos, however, is easier to imagine. The storerooms filled with pithoi suggest centralized control of goods. These jars were massive, often taller than a person, and filled with grain, oil, or wine. Their sheer size implies not household storage, but large-scale redistribution. Scribes tracked the contents on clay tablets, ensuring accountability. This system resembles an early bureaucracy, where control of food and goods reinforced social hierarchy. In a way, the palace was less a royal residence than a distribution center, a Bronze Age warehouse with frescoes and rituals attached. The workshops add another layer. Archaeologists have found evidence of pottery making, metalworking, and textile production within the palace. This suggests that Knossos was not just about storage, but also about manufacturing. Craftsmen labored in rooms adjacent to ceremonial spaces, producing goods that would have been distributed across the island or traded abroad. The hum of industry mingled with the rhythm of ritual, practicality existing side by side with spectacle. For a modern visitor, it might feel strange to imagine sacred ceremonies happening just down the hall from smiths hammering bronze. But at Knossos, the boundaries between sacred and practical blurred constantly. This blend of functions gives the palace an almost modern feel. Administrative offices, warehouses, workshops, and ceremonial halls coexisted in a single complex. It was as if the government, the church, the market, and the theater all decided to move into the same building and share the rent. Efficiency, perhaps, but also confusion. No wonder the Greeks imagined it as a labyrinth. When one building tries to be everything, it inevitably becomes overwhelming. As centuries passed and Knossos declined, memory of the actual functions faded. What remained was impression, a great complex twisting corridors, bulls, rituals, and shadows. Out of these impressions grew the myths of Minoan and the Labyrinth. In that sense, the myths are not lies but echoes. They are distorted memories of real features, transformed by time into stories that could survive oral tradition. The labyrinth was real, not as an underground maze but as an architectural experience. The Minotaur may not have prowled its halls, but bulls certainly mattered in ritual and art. Ariadne's thread may not have existed, but anyone wandering Knossos without a guide might wish for one. Today, when tourists walk through the reconstructed halls, they often marvel at how modern the palace feels. Light wells, staircases, and plumbing systems seem advanced for their age. But this sense of modernity is partly an illusion, shaped by Evans's reconstructions. The painted frescoes, the reimagined throne room, the bright colors, all of these give an impression of freshness that may not reflect reality. The ruins alone would feel more distant, more ancient. Evans's work brings them closer, but at the cost of blurring truth with interpretation. Visitors leave impressed, though not always aware of how much of what they saw was ancient, and how much was modern imagination. Knossos remains a site of tension between history and myth, between ruin and reconstruction, between certainty and speculation. It is not a palace that reveals itself easily. Instead, it forces us into its labyrinth, guiding us down passages of theory, speculation, and partial truths. Perhaps that is why it endures in memory. A palace that explained itself fully would eventually fade into textbooks. A palace that refuses to explain becomes immortal, and as we drift deeper into its silence, the labyrinth unfolds further, leading into new chambers of thought, corridors of memory, and the shadowed spaces where history slips quietly into the corridors of interpretation, where scholars spend years debating what the palace meant to the people who built it. For them, it was never just one thing. It was not only a home for rulers, more solely a warehouse for oil, more entirely a temple. It was all of these at once, a hybrid space where power, economy, and religion folded together. That complexity may be why later Greeks could only explain it with the story of a labyrinth. It felt too tangled for ordinary categories. One theme that threads through Minoan life is their relationship with the sea. Crete sits in the center of the eastern Mediterranean, and the Minoans embraced their position. Ships carried them outward, linking them with Egypt, Cyprus, and the Levant. Archaeologists even described them as having a thalassocracy, a kind of sea empire built on trade rather than conquest. The sea gave them prosperity and identity. Frescoes of dolphins and ships are not just decoration, but declarations of who they were. The palace of Knossos may have stood on land, but its wealth came from waves. In this light, the bull-leaping scenes take on another dimension. Bulls were strong, unpredictable, and dangerous. Much like the sea, to leap over one was to master chaos without destroying it, to move with grace in the face of danger. Perhaps the ritual symbolized the same balance they sought in their maritime life, risking the deep but surviving through agility. Whether or not acrobats truly vaulted live bulls, the symbolism would have resonated. Rituals often compress everyday anxieties into performance, and for the Minoans, the sea was both lifeline and threat. Another striking detail about Knossos is the lack of fortifications. Unlike the later Mycenaean palaces, which bristled with defensive walls, Knossos was relatively open. Evans took this as proof of a peaceful society. Modern scholars are less certain. It is possible that Crete's geography, combined with naval power, offered security without walls. It is also possible that defenses existed in other forms, patrols, fleets, or simply the assumption that isolation was protection enough. The absence of walls does not guarantee the absence of conflict, but it does highlight a cultural difference. Where mainland rulers built citadels, the Minoans built open palaces filled with art. Their priorities were not identical, and that contrast is telling. The art itself can feel strangely modern in its playfulness. Frescoes show people in motion, their bodies slim and fluid. Even details like skin color are stylized, with men often painted darker and women lighter, perhaps to distinguish roles or simply as an artistic convention. Clothes are brightly patterned, jewelry sparkles, and hair is styled in elaborate curls. The impression is one of energy, fashion, and display. These were not austere images meant to intimidate. They seem designed to delight, to celebrate life. It is a far cry from the stern statues of pharaohs or the rigid carvings of Mesopotamian kings. The Minoans, through their art, come across as people who valued beauty and movement, even if their society was just as hierarchical as others. Yet, beauty can be deceiving. Behind frescoes of dolphins and dancers lay the labor of countless workers. The pissoir filled with oil did not appear by magic. Farmers tilled fields, herders tended flocks, and sailors risked storms. The palace system extracted their surplus, channeled it into storerooms, and redistributed it as the elite saw fit. Knossos may look enchanting now, but to the people who supplied its wealth, it may have felt more like obligation. A labyrinth can be dazzling, but it can also be confining. The same corridors that impressed visitors also controlled movement, channeling labor into service of the center. This raises the question of collapse. When the palace system finally fell, was it external disaster or internal strain? The eruption of Thera and its tsunamis must have shaken the island, but centuries passed before the final destruction. Perhaps repeated earthquakes and fires wore down resilience. Perhaps the burden of supporting palatial elites became unsustainable. Or perhaps outside forces, Mycenaeans, raiders, or shifting trade networks tipped the balance. Collapse is rarely a single event. It is more like a slow crumbling, where stresses accumulate until the system cannot hold. Knossos endured multiple rebuildings, but even resilience has limits. After the decline, the myths took over. For the Greeks, Knossos became the labyrinth, and Minos became the tyrant who built it. Theseus, the Athenian hero, turned Crete's memory into a stepping stone for Athens' self-image. The labyrinth story was retold in plays, poems, and art, embedding Knossos into cultural imagination long after its true history was forgotten. The palace may have fallen silent, but in myth it roared louder than ever. That is one of history's little ironies. Civilizations that write their own names in stone can vanish, while civilizations that inspire stories can live forever. When Evans dug up Knossos, he revived both the ruins and the myths. His reconstructions leaned into the legendary aura, giving visitors a palace that felt alive again. Even if his interpretations were flawed, they kept the site vivid. Tourists now walk through halls that are half ancient, half modern, and wholly dreamlike. The labyrinth continues, not in stone corridors, but in our interpretations. Every visitor, every scholar, every storyteller adds another passage, another turn, and as we wander deeper in thought, Knossos stretches again, its silence layered with echoes, drifting towards still lore chambers where history and myth blur into the half-light of speculation, where every fresco fragment becomes a canvas for theories, One of the more puzzling aspects of Knossos is how much of its imagery centers around ritual rather than war. Other Bronze Age civilizations loved to portray conquests, chariots, and soldiers. At Knossos, the walls are quieter, filled instead with processions, dances, and ceremonies. This has led some scholars to argue that the Minoans were less militaristic than their neighbors. Yet, we should be careful not to take silence as proof. Weapons are found in graves, and Crete certainly had warriors. The absence of battle scenes may say more about artistic taste than about reality. Perhaps they preferred to hang dolphins on their walls while storing swords in their storeroom. The labyrinthine design of the palace may also have been part of ritual itself. Imagine being a visitor, ushered into a procession that wound through corridors, turning corners, climbing stairs, and finally spilling into the central courtyard. The journey itself would have felt disorienting, setting the stage for awe. Architecture can act as theater, and Knossos may have used space to shape experience. Even today, walking through the ruins leaves visitors confused and impressed at once, as though the building were designed not just to house people but to manipulate them. The central courtyard remains the beating heart of the complex, large enough to gather crowds. It must have hosted rituals and ceremonies on a scale the surrounding rooms could not match. Scholars imagine bull-leaping feasts and public processions unfolding there. The walls rising around the courtyard would have framed the events like a stage set, amplifying their grandeur. For ordinary participants, stepping into that open space after winding through dim corridors would have been startling. A sudden expansion that felt dramatic. The contrast between enclosed hallways and broad courtyards may have been intentional, a way to heighten emotional impact. Knossos also reveals the Minoan fascination with nature. Sessions show lilies, birds, monkeys, and marine life. Animals were not just background decoration, they were central to imagery. Some rooms even have stylized landscapes painted on their walls, suggesting an appreciation for scenery. It is tempting to read this as evidence of a people unusually attuned to the natural world. Yet again, we tread on uncertain ground. Perhaps these images were not celebrations but symbolic references, their meanings lost to us. Still, the sheer abundance of nature in their art makes the Minoans stand out among Bronze Age cultures. They seemed to prefer dolphins to chariots, lilies to spears. That choice, whatever its deeper meaning, is telling. The mystery of lineae hangs over all of this. Hundreds of tablets and inscriptions survive, but without translation they remain mute. Scholars have tried to link the script to known languages, from early Greek to Anatolian tongues, but no attempt has succeeded. The problem is not just the symbols themselves, but the lack of long texts. Most inscriptions are short, perhaps inventories or dedications, leaving little context for comparison. Without a Rosetta Stone, lineae may never yield its secrets, and so the Minoans remain partly invisible, their voices trapped in clay. The labyrinth is not only physical, but linguistic. We wander its corridors with no Ariadne's thread to guide us. This silence creates space for projection. Evans projected his vision of a peaceful, matriarchal society. Later scholars projected other models, hierarchical bureaucracies, warrior elites, or ritual theocracies. Each theory reflects as much about the scholar's time as about the Minoans. Archaeology is rarely neutral. It is shaped by the questions we ask and the assumptions we bring. In that sense, Knossos is not just a ruin, but a mirror, reflecting the ideas of whoever studies it. The labyrinth bends to the thinker, offering different exits depending on where one chooses to turn. The endurance of Knossos lies in this balance between accessibility and mystery. Too much clarity, and it would be a solved puzzle filed away in history books. Too much obscurity, and it would be forgotten rubble. Instead, it offers just enough to draw us in, but never enough to let us leave. That is why the labyrinth endures, not only in stone, but in imagination. Despite these uncertainties, the Knossos remains oddly accessible. Visitors today walk through painted corridors, climb staircases, and peer into reconstructed chambers. The site is not fenced off in glass cases, but lived in, walked upon. Touch, you can feel the stone beneath your hands. Trace the grooves left by ancient builders. This physicality gives the ruins a presence that written sources alone could never match. Even if we cannot read linear A, we can walk the same stairs. That experience bridges millennia in a way no translation could. And yet, for all the tactile immediacy, the palace keeps its distance. It is like a dream you can touch, but not fully explain. You stand in the throne room, but you do not know who sat there. You look at frescoes, but you do not know what they meant. You trace corridors, but you do not know why they twist, as they do. Every answer slides into another question, as if the labyrinth were designed not to be solved, but to keep us wandering. When you look at the other palaces, a pattern emerges. They share the same basic design: central courtyards, storerooms, light wells, staircases, and ceremonial rooms. Each is like a sibling to Knossos, similar in form but varied in detail. This consistency suggests a common cultural blueprint, a way of organizing space that reflected Minoan values. If Knossos was a labyrinth, then the whole island was a constellation of labyrinths, each palace a node in the network. Together, they formed a palatial system that defined Minoan life. And so, as we follow its shadowed passages, the palace stretches once more, its echoes folding into deeper turns, leading us further along the dim corridors of history that open quietly into the quiet persistence of ruins, where stone outlives memory and memory reinvents stone. Knossos is not alone on Crete. Other palaces, Phaistos, Melia, Sakros, each carry their own fragments of Minoan life. Yet Knossos dominates because of its size, its myths, and the sheer boldness of its reconstruction. To speak of Minoan civilization is often to speak of Knossos, even though it was only one part of a wider network. This imbalance is not unusual. History tends to favor capitals and spectacular sites while leaving smaller settlements in obscurity. But it does mean that our vision of the Minoans is filtered heavily through the labyrinth of one palace, as if the whole civilization could be captured in its walls. Still, Knossos alone is tangled with myth. The others did not acquire Minotaurs or Ariadne's threads. Perhaps this is because Knossos was the largest, or because later Greeks happened to spin their stories around it. Either way, its fame grew disproportionate. The palace became both historical site and legendary stage, while Phaistos and Melia remained in the background. That unevenness continues today. Tourists flock to Knossos in droves, while the other sites attract smaller, quieter crowds. The labyrinth, it seems, casts a long shadow, even in modern tourism. Walking through the ruins now, you can almost sense the layers of time pressing together. Bronze Age builders laid the first stones. Centuries later, Mycenaean administrators walked the same floors, scratching records into clay tablets. Then silence fell, the palace collapsing into ruin, covered by earth and vegetation. Local villagers built farms nearby, aware of old stones but not their significance. Then Evans arrived, buying land, hiring workers, and peeling back centuries of soil. Each layer added its own presence. and each is still there, mingled in the sight. When you step into Knossos today, you are not simply walking into the Bronze Age, you are also walking into the early 20th century, when archaeology was part science, part theatre. The criticisms of Evans are worth pausing over. His reconstructions, painted bright and rebuilt in concrete, sometimes mislead visitors into thinking they are looking at original Bronze Age walls. Purists argue this distorts the truth. Yet, without his interventions, Knossos might appear only as piles of stone, harder to imagine and less vivid to the casual eye. His vision, flawed as it may be, gave the Minoans a stage in the modern imagination. Without him, Knossos might have remained a footnote rather than a tourist destination. Archaeology often struggles between accuracy and accessibility, and Evans leaned decisively toward accessibility. The result is a palace that feels alive, but is also half dream. This tension raises a question. What do we want from ruins? Do we want them as they truly are, bare stone and uncertainty? Or do we want them interpreted, reconstructed, made vivid enough to feel? Knossos offers both, depending on where you stand. Some corners are untouched ruin, stones scattered, staircases broken. Other corners are painted and polished, more theatrical than authentic. The visitor moves between them without always realizing the shift. The labyrinth is not only ancient but modern, a blend of past and present that refuses to separate. Despite the reconstructions, the sense of mystery persists. Stand in a storeroom lined with pithawat, and you feel the weight of goods once stored there. Walk into a corridor where light filters through a shaft, and you sense the intentional design. Step into the courtyard, and you can almost hear the echoes of processions long gone. These impressions linger even if you know the reconstructions are modern. Something in the architecture itself, in the bones of the building, communicates across time. The palace may be partly imagination, but the stones still carry their own authority. Knossos is not only a site of archaeology, but of cultural identity. For Crete and for Greece, more broadly, it represents a deep past that predates the classical world. The Minoans are often presented as Europe's first advanced civilization, a foundation stone of Western history. This framing can be flattering, but also misleading, as if history were a straight line from dolphins on plaster to Plato in Athens. In reality, the Minoans were their own people, with their own priorities, and their legacy is as much about disappearance as continuity. They left no direct line into classical Greece, only echoes that shaped myth. Yet myths are powerful. The Labyrinth, the Minotaur, Ariadne. These stories kept Knossos alive in memory long after its walls fell. Even when people forgot the real history, they remembered the shadow, and when Evans uncovered the ruins, those myths returned to meet the stones, merging legend with excavation. The result is a palace that feels doubly haunted by both its real past and its imagined one. Few ruins carry such layered presence, where history and myth cling so tightly that they cannot be separated. And so, as you let the thought linger, the palace continues its drift, not toward clarity, but toward deeper entanglement, its corridors winding on and on, until they dissolve quietly into the quiet realization that some mysteries may never be solved. And perhaps they do not need to be. Knossos is valuable not because it tells us everything about the Minoans, but because it refuses to tell us enough. That refusal forces us to think, to imagine, to question. The labyrinth is not just a structure of stone, but a structure of thought guiding us into endless debates about what it meant, who built it, and why it mattered. If you pause in one of the reconstructed rooms, looking at the painted dolphins or griffins. You are engaging in a conversation across millennia. The Minoan artisans who painted the originals worked with pigments on plaster, perhaps proud of their work, perhaps simply following instructions. They never imagined tourists in shorts and sun hats would be squinting at their brushstrokes 4,000 years later. They never imagined their palace would inspire myths of monsters or become a centerpiece in arguments between scholars. To them, it was just part of life. To us, it is an endless labyrinth of fascination. The persistence of the site also says something about human memory. Most of the people who lived in Crete during the Bronze Age are forgotten, their names and lives erased by time. Yet the stones of Knossos endure, dragging fragments of their world forward. Civilization is fragile, but architecture is stubborn. The palace stands as a monument to human ambition, to the desire to build something so large and complex that it could not be ignored. That ambition succeeded, though not in the way its builders expected. They did not survive, but their labyrinth did. There is also a quiet irony in how Knossos is remembered. The myths that preserved its name are tales of horror, a monster imprisoned, young lives sacrificed, a tyrant ruling through fear. Yet the palace itself shows images of play, dance, and sea life. The Greeks remembered Crete through stories of darkness, but the Minoans painted it in color. Perhaps this mismatch is inevitable. Memory distorts, myths magnify shadows. The labyrinth that survives in our minds is a blend of brightness and fear, never one without the other. Today, archaeologists still work at Knossos, carefully peeling back layers that Evans overlooked or reshaped. Technology helps ground penetrating radar, chemical analysis of pigments, microscopic study of ceramics. Each method uncovers new details, but none rewrites the whole story. Knossos continues to resist finality. It offers glimpses, but never certainty. It is as if the palace itself insists on being a labyrinth, not just in layout, but in meaning. You can wander through its rooms for a lifetime and never find the center. For visitors, this may be the palace's greatest gift. A ruin that explains itself completely becomes a lesson. A ruin that withholds explanation becomes a dream. Knossos invites us to dream. We drift through its corridors, real or imagined, following threads of thought that may lead nowhere, but still matter because of the wandering itself. The labyrinth does not need a minotaur to hold power. Its power lies in its refusal to end. And so the shadowed halls of Knossos remain, not as answers carved in stone, but as questions whispered across time. The palace stands on its hill in Crete, half ruin, half reconstruction, wholly a labyrinth of history. We may never solve it, but perhaps that is the point. Some places are not meant to be solved. They are meant to be walked, to be wondered at, to remind us that the past is always larger, stranger, and more elusive than we imagine. The labyrinth does not close. It drifts on, echoing softly into the silence of its own shadows. This story closes like a page turned in a well-worn book, but every ending leads to another beginning, and the next tale is ready to unfold. This is the floating markets of the Khmer, Waterways of Angkor. When we picture Angkor, the image that usually rises first is stone. The great towers of Angkor Wat pointing into the sky, the broad causeways lined with carved nagas, the intricate reliefs of apsaras frozen in eternal dance, all of it in stone, enduring the centuries with that stubborn dignity that temples do. But if you drift your attention slightly away from the sandstone, if you let the imagination slide from dry causeways down toward water, you find a different Angkor. Not the Angkor of emperors' monuments, but the Angkor of canals, boats and markets that floated like lilies across its reservoirs and rivers. For the Khmer Empire, which reached its height between the 9th and 15th centuries, was less a kingdom of land than a kingdom of water. The geography of Cambodia almost insisted upon it. The Mekong River cuts through the region, carrying not just water but people, fish, goods, and stories. More than that, the great freshwater body known as the Tonle Sap sat at the heart of Khmer life. This lake is a strange one, performing a yearly trick of breathing. During the monsoon, the Mekong swells and actually pushes water backwards into the Tonle Sap, causing the lake to expand to several times its dry season size. Then, in the dry months, the flow reverses and the lake shrinks back again. A vast lung of water in the middle of the empire, inhaling and exhaling, dictating the rhythms of fish and rice and all who depended on them. If Angkor was built on stone, it was sustained on that living, moving flood. It was here that floating markets found their natural stage. If you imagine an ordinary market on land, the sounds of bargaining, the smells of herbs and grilled fish, the bright scatter of fruits and fabrics, then imagine the same scene hovering on water. Boats pulled up alongside one another became stalls. Canoes heavy with rice or lotus flowers drifted like wheeled carts. Instead of dusty streets, the thoroughfares were rippling canals, and the tide became the market schedule. Angkor's engineers might have been famous for temples, but they were equally brilliant at waterways. They carved out canals to redirect floods, link reservoirs, and make possible the constant traffic of goods. Every floating market was stitched into this watery grid. The Khmer rulers themselves leaned heavily on these water systems. Jayavarman, perhaps the most ambitious of them all, covered the empire with public works, roads, hospitals and reservoirs called bares. These were not little ornamental ponds. Some stretched for miles, carefully aligned, capturing monsoon water and distributing it through canals to rice fields and towns. The floating markets were not accidents bobbing on the edges. They were part of the design, serving the circulation of trade, much like a heart's ventricles. Keep blood moving. To picture Angkor without these floating bazaars would be to imagine a body without veins. Descriptions from the period are scarce, because the Khmer left fewer written records than stone reliefs, but we can read hints in the accounts of Chinese envoys. Zhou Daguan, a diplomat from Yuan, China, who visited Angkor in the late 13th century, left one of the rare eyewitness reports. He described not only the palaces and court rituals, but also the everyday commerce. He wrote of boats filled with fish, pigs, fruits, and woven goods. He noted how people moved easily on water, as if it were the ordinary pavement of their lives. From his words, the picture of floating markets becomes more tangible. These were not exotic exceptions, but daily necessity. After all, when roads turned to mud in the rains, boats kept moving. In these markets, the variety of goods was wide. Fish dominated, of course, because the Tonle Sap was one of the most productive freshwater fisheries on Earth. Vast hauls of catfish and carp, preserved in salt or fermented into prahok, became staples, but other things appeared too. Baskets of rice from irrigated paddies, bananas, coconuts, and sugar palms, spices traded from further afield, textiles woven from silk or cotton, and for those with more wealth, ornaments of bronze, silver, or imported ceramics from China. The floating market was less a boutique of luxuries and more the general store of the empire, though with the occasional shiny indulgence drifting by. It's worth pausing on the fish. Without refrigeration, the Khmer developed ways to preserve protein, and prohok, fermented fish paste, became the backbone of cuisine. If you're imagining a gentle condiment, think again. The smell is famously potent, and for outsiders it can be overwhelming, but for the Khmer it was and remains essential. To stand at a floating market and see heaps of fish destined for this transformation is to glimpse the very fuel of Angkor's population. Stone temples are beautiful, but fish paste fed the builders. The floating markets also carried social texture. They were not just places to buy and sell, they were places where people met, exchanged news, arranged marriages, or simply watched one another. In a society where the court was distant and the temples eternal, the market was the here and now. Gossip floated along with rice sacks. Alliances of families and villages were reinforced by who traded with whom. In quiet ways, these markets were also centers of power, shaping reputations and fortunes beneath the notice of the king. The empire's officials might have focused on tributes and taxes, but ordinary prosperity was negotiated boat by boat. It is tempting to romanticize this as quaint or idyllic, but life on water had its difficulties. Mosquitoes bred in the wetlands, and diseases followed. Boats capsized, crocodiles lurked in some stretches, and the endless work of rowing, hauling, and balancing could not have felt picturesque to those whose bodies bore the strain. Yet, as with so many human adaptations, people did not dwell on the hardship. They simply lived in rhythm with the water. The floating market was both livelihood and survival, woven seamlessly into the annual pulse of the monsoon. The water culture of Angkor also seeped into religion and symbolism. Hindu and Buddhist cosmology spoke of oceans of milk and rivers of life. The Waterways were sometimes thought of as earthly reflections of mythical seas. Temples often had moats, not only for defense but for symbolic resonance, suggesting the sacred mountains surrounded by cosmic waters. When people rowed their boats to market, they were moving through a landscape where the mundane and the divine blurred. Buying a basket of mangoes might take place beside a reservoir built as a cosmic ocean, which is a rather lofty backdrop for groceries. As Angkor prospered, the scale of these floating markets must have swelled. Picture, if you can, not just a handful of boats, but hundreds, perhaps thousands, clustering in knots, forming temporary neighborhoods on water. Shouts of bargaining in Khmer mingled with foreign tongues from traders who ventured up the Mekong. The markets were dynamic, shifting with the seasons and the flood levels. In dry months, more activity clustered near shrunken waterways. In flood months, boats could reach villages otherwise cut off, and the market followed them. Permanence was not the point. Adaptability was, and slowly, these waterborne exchanges connected Angkor to the wider world. Chinese ceramics arrived on boats. Textiles from India traveled upriver. Even ideas floated in. Buddhism itself, in its Mahayana and later Theravada forms, traveled along these watery routes, carried by monks and merchants alike. The floating markets were, in their unassuming way, part of global current. Angkor might look like a world unto itself, but its waterways were doors as much as boundaries. Of course, all empires eventually ebb, and so did Angkor. By the 15th century, pressures from neighbors, shifts in trade routes, and perhaps even the over-complexity of its water system led to decline. Some scholars argue that the delicate balance of canals and reservoirs became too difficult to maintain, especially when monsoon patterns shifted. When the hydraulic machine faltered, so too did the empire that depended on it. The floating markets, once busy with goods, may have thinned to a few stubborn boats, yet water life did not vanish. Even after Angkor's political collapse, floating villages persisted on the Tonle Sap, and markets remain. To this day, in Cambodia, you can visit them, a living echo of a 1,000-year-old rhythm. What is striking in all this is how little remains in stone. The temples dominate tourist photos, but the real arteries of Angkor were liquid, leaving only faint traces. Canals silted in, barrays became fields, and boats rotted away. Archaeologists now use satellite imagery to trace the ghost grids of waterways, finding the veins of an empire hidden under forest and farmland. The floating markets themselves left almost no direct evidence, for boats and baskets do not endure like sandstone towers, but by piecing together texts, reliefs, and the persistence of water culture, the outlines reappear. The contrast is oddly poignant. We marvel at what was carved to last forever, yet the true lifeblood was what flowed and vanished. Angkor was a water empire, and its floating markets were everyday proof of that. Not glorious, not monumental, but quietly indispensable. To drift in imagination among those boats is to see Angkor from the level of its people rather than its kings, and that, perhaps, is the most grounding view of all. As we continue to glide along these waters, it becomes clearer how deeply the Khmer sense of identity, politics, and ritual was tied to this aquatic stage, and how the floating markets fit within a larger choreography of power and survival, because the Khmer rulers themselves were not above relying on this watery network. In fact, their power was, in a very literal sense, buoyed by it. When we talk about kings of Angkor, names like Suryavarman II and Jayavarman VII are often rolled out for their architectural achievements. One building Angkor Wat, the other sprawling out hospitals, temples, and causeways. But beneath all that stone lay a logistical truth. Without rice and fish moving smoothly through canals and floating markets, the emperors would have had no surplus to fund construction, no armies to march, and no courtly spectacles to impress foreign envoys. Power looked like sandstone towers, that was actually built on boats full of food. The ritual aspect of this dependence is interesting to consider. Kings often styled themselves as god kings, or devarajas, uniting worldly rule with divine legitimacy. Temples presented them as cosmic lords, yet every year the reversal of the Tonle Sap reminded everyone that the heavens could override even emperors. When the river reversed its flow, it was as if nature staged its own coronation ceremony. The markets swelled with the abundance of fish, and families preserved what they could. The king might have been divine, but the river was a trickster god of its own. This irony hung quietly over the floating markets, where common folk knew very well which tide truly governed their lives. Another layer of Angkor's watery complexity came from the design of barrays. These massive reservoirs were feats of engineering, dug by hand with remarkable precision. The West Barray, for example, stretched about 5 miles long and nearly 1.5 miles wide, covering roughly 12 square kilometers. It wasn't just a pretty pond, it was an enormous storage tank that regulated the empire's water supply. Around its edges, markets likely clustered, for wherever water gathered, people followed. Farmers needed irrigation, traders needed harbors, and priests needed ritual water. The floating markets became the practical interface between sacred infrastructure and ordinary livelihood. A god king might walk the causeways, but his subjects rode the canals. Trade itself was layered too. There was the village-to-village exchange of food and daily goods, the regional trade across the Mekong Basin, and the long-distance trade linking Angkor to China, India, and beyond. The floating markets primarily handled the first two, but that doesn't make them small. They were, in effect, the distribution system that kept villages supplied and surpluses moving upward. Think of them as the empire's informal post office and grocery chain combined, though instead of letters and canned goods, they carried woven mats, rice baskets, and salted fish. These were the mundane details that multiplied thousands of times sustained imperial grandeur. Show Dagwan's observations offer some revealing details about how this played out socially. He noted that elite women rarely left their homes, but common women could be seen selling goods, especially in markets. This means that floating markets may have provided spaces where women's labor was publicly visible and economically vital. Boats steered by women, loaded with produce, were not marginal. They were central. It hints at a quiet balance of power. Temples glorified male rulers, but food markets depended heavily on female traders. History tends to leave stone records of kings and ignore wooden records of women, but water life tilted things toward more hidden equalities. The floating markets also offered a stage for foreigners. Chinese merchants, Chan sailors from present-day Vietnam, and traders from Malay lands would have encountered these markets as they passed upriver. To them, Angkor may have looked exotic, but in practice they dealt with boat sellers haggling over the price of dried fish. A visiting dignitary might be led through temple courts, but a sailor hauling ceramics saw instead the press of canoes and the splash of oars. Markets often cut through cultural distance more effectively than diplomacy did. Bargaining required fewer interpreters than treaties. In this sense, floating markets were soft borders, smoothing the passage of goods and ideas across regions. Culturally, the Khmer relationship with water created some eccentric habits. Ceremonies often included ritual bathing or water pouring, connecting purity with flowing streams. Village life revolved around riverside. The soundscape would have been layered: the slap of water against hulls, the creak of bamboo poles, vendors calling out, children splashing. To live in Angkor was to live within earshot of water. Even funerals sometimes involved floating offerings downstream, carrying prayers away like cargo. In such a world, floating markets were not special events, but natural extensions of daily life. The distinction between land and water blurred until one hardly noticed it. Of course, the empire's water system was not immune to trouble. The canals required constant maintenance. Silt built up, weeds clogged channels, and floods could tear apart embankments. Markets, dependent on smooth waterways, mirrored this fragility. A blocked canal meant stranded boats and villages cut off. During years of erratic monsoons, the abundance of fish could collapse, leaving markets thin and strained. Archaeologists studying Angkor's decline point to climate shifts in the 14th century, when unusually severe droughts and floods alternated. In such unstable times, floating markets would have been the first to reveal the cracks. Fewer boats, emptier baskets, more arguments over dwindling supplies. If temples were the empire's proud face, the markets were its pulse, and that pulse began to falter. It's telling that after Angkor's fall, water markets did not vanish. They simply adapted. The capital shifted southward toward Phnom Penh, closer to where the Mekong and Tonle Sap meet. But the same rhythms of floating trade continue. This endurance suggests that floating markets were not inventions of empire, but older traditions. woven so tightly into Cambodian life that even political collapse could not wash them away. Today, villages like Kampong Phluk and Kampong Kong Kalang still host floating markets on the Tonle Sap, their wooden houses perched on stilts, their boats selling fish, rice, and bright plastic buckets imported from far away. The persistence is a kind of living archaeology, reminding us that water commerce was always more resilient than royal ambition. One might ask why so much importance should be placed on markets rather than temples, when the latter clearly dominate the historical record. The answer is that without the mundane exchange of food, tools, and gossip, temples would have been empty shells. Monuments were sustained by the floating hum of daily trade. In a way, to study floating markets is to study the invisible foundation of Angkor, the part that stone does not tell. It is not glamorous, but it is honest. Empires may rise on dreams of divinity, but they survive on baskets of mangoes ferried across a reservoir. There's also a certain irony in how invisible floating markets became in historical memory. Stone lasts, wood and water do not. Archaeologists can reconstruct temple layouts to the inch, but must guess at the locations of markets. And yet, anyone who has spent time in a Cambodian floating village knows that the market is the real social theatre. Perhaps, in this, there is a quiet lesson. What endures in stone is not always what endured in life. The Angkor Wat tourists photograph was never the whole Angkor. The rest of it drifted away, season by season, in boats piled with fish paste and bananas, never intending to last, yet shaping centuries all the same. And as the empire's water culture flowed into its decline, the floating markets would have carried both continuity and melancholy. Imagine the late years of Angkor, canals still filled with boats but fewer foreign traders arriving, fewer temple projects underway. Markets still buzzed, but with a sense of contraction, as though the empire's lungs were not inhaling as fully as before. Yet people continued to buy and sell, because life does not pause for imperial fortune. The floating market was both a symptom and a solution, shrinking with hardship but never disappearing. While kings worried about invasions and lost battles, villagers kept rowing because dinner could not wait. As the centuries passed and colonial eyes turned toward Cambodia, floating markets once again became a subject of outside fascination. French explorers in the 19th century described them in glowing terms, often with that mix of admiration and condescension so common in colonial accounts. To them, the floating market seemed quaint, picturesque, an odd survival of a bygone age. They did not see them as what they truly were, the practical, persistent backbone of rural life. In that sense, the markets performed a quiet trick of endurance, slipping beneath the notice of those who preferred temples and kings, but continuing anyway. And that perhaps is the most Angkorian legacy of all. Structures may crumble, dynasties may fade, but boats will still gather where people need to eat. Drifting further, one begins to sense how Angkor's water story was never only about technology or trade, but about a worldview in which water was not background but protagonist. The floating markets were just one expression of this larger sensibility, where rivers, lakes, and canals carried not just goods but meaning. To live in the Khmer world was to accept that power floated, quite literally, on water. And this understanding of power resting on water extended into nearly every corner of Khmer life. One can almost feel how the rhythm of the river shaped not only agriculture and trade, but the very concept of time. The reversal of the Tonle Sap was more than a hydrological oddity. It functioned as a calendar event, a yearly reminder that everything was tied to the flood. Farmers planted rice with its rise. Fishermen cast their nets as its waters fattened with fish. and the floating market swelled with activity to match. Time was measured less by the number of years a king reigned, and more by the pulse of water arriving and withdrawing. Even temple festivals were scheduled in accordance with these changes. The markets, therefore, were not random gatherings, but participants in a natural clock that dictated when abundance or scarcity would drift in. The waterways of Angkor were astonishing in their scale. Archaeologists who mapped the landscape from satellites see not just one or two canals, but a vast spiderweb of lines cutting across the terrain. Some of them ran straight for miles, others branched to meet reservoirs, and still more connected villages to the main arteries. In this mesh of water, floating markets would appear wherever enough boats converged. A major canal might host a permanent hub, while a smaller one became a seasonal gathering that swelled when harvests were plentiful. The adaptability of these markets is perhaps their most impressive feature. They had no fixed walls, no stone foundations, no permanent stalls. They could grow, shrink, or vanish, depending on circumstances. If one place silts up, the market simply drifts somewhere else. This was commerce, with the agility of water itself. Such agility was essential in an empire where hierarchy was rigid. At the top sat the king and his court, commanding temples and armies. Beneath them were nobles and officials, tasked with organizing labor for the empire's monumental project. Yet, all of these lofty structures depended on peasants growing rice and fishermen hauling nets. The floating markets were where those peasants converted their work into sustenance, and occasionally a bit of wealth. They sold rice to traders, who might carry it up to the court. They exchanged fish for tools, or mats for fruit. The markets softened the edges of hierarchy. A noble might eat imported Chinese porcelain's worth of delicacies, but that porcelain passed through hands in floating markets before arriving at his table. It was a quiet reminder that even god-kings ultimately ate what the boats carried. One can imagine the sensory palate of these markets. The smell of fermented prahok thick in the air, competing with the sweetness of palm sugar boiling in clay pots. The sight of green coconuts stacked beside gleaming silver bangles. The steady splash of paddles mixing with the calls of vendors repeating prices until they blurred into background noise. Smoke rising from small stoves balanced on boat planks, grilling fish until the oily scent mingled with damp reeds. The floating market was a symphony in which every sense was engaged, though in a calm, repetitive way that became as familiar as breathing. For people of Angkor, this was less an adventure than the simple fabric of life. Religion drifted through these markets in subtle ways. Buddhist monks, clad in saffron robes, often appeared, their bowls out for alms. Vendors would offer food, seeking merit through generosity. In return, the monks gave blessings, turning the market into a space of both exchange and spiritual transaction. Hindu practices lingered too, particularly in earlier centuries, when traders might set small offerings afloat, hoping for protection from river spirits. In this mingling, markets became miniature temples of daily devotion. One did not need to climb Angkor Wat's towers to touch the sacred. A simple handful of rice offered on water carried its own weight. Foreign accounts give us glimpses of how outsiders perceived these markets. Zhou Daguan described an economy where barter dominated, money being less central than goods for goods exchange. He noted silk, honey, and wax among the traded items. To a Chinese envoy accustomed to bustling city markets on land, the floating version must have seemed both strange and efficient. There is a wry humor in imagining his bewilderment at a system where one's shopping trip required steady balance in a rocking canoe. but efficiency it was. Bargaining across boats was faster than slogging through muddy roads. Where land failed, water excelled. The floating markets also reflected a delicate environmental balance. The Tonle Sap's fertility depended on the flood, bringing nutrients and fish. People learned to read these cycles intimately, knowing when certain species would migrate, when rice fields would flood, and when to expect bumper harvests. The markets mirrored these cycles, their stalls swelling or shrinking in harmony. In years of generous floods, baskets overflowed. In years of poor flow, anxiety trickled through conversations. The markets were a barometer of ecological health, long before climate science existed. If boats arrived lighter, everyone knew trouble loomed. Interestingly, markets also served as informal courts of opinion. While the king held official power, gossip held social power, and gossip flowed best where people gathered. A boat vendor who cheated customers might find her reputation drifting downstream, cutting off trade in villages yet unseen. Families could gain honor by consistently fair dealings, or lose face by arrogance. In this sense, the floating market was a social regulator, enforcing honesty and cooperation without formal law. The empire's officials could build stone courts, but real justice often floated quietly among baskets of rice and piles of mangoes. We can also imagine the texture of inequality in these spaces. A fisherman's wife selling dried fish likely rubbed elbows with a wealthier trader importing silks. Their boats differed in size, their goods in value, but the water leveled them to some degree. Both had to balance their wares on the same current. Both haggled beneath the same sun. Floating markets, while not eliminating class divides, at least placed everyone within the same precarious framework. A boat that could tip, a tide that could change. There was a reminder that water has little regard for hierarchy, and that survival was a shared negotiation. As centuries passed and Angkor's reach shrank, floating markets endured, adapting to new rulers and new economies. When the Khmer capital shifted south and regional trade focused more on maritime routes, floating markets along inland canals continued to supply daily needs. They were too practical to disappear. Even under later colonial rule, when officials measured rice output and mapped villages, markets kept floating as they always had, resisting the urge to fix them to charts. Their informality was their strength. The archaeological challenge today is that these markets left so few traces. Temples endure because stone resists rot, but boats decay, baskets crumble, and wooden poles vanish. Only faint marks remain, sometimes visible in soil, where mooring posts once stood. The markets are known primarily through texts, comparative traditions, and the persistence of water villages that still operate on Tonle Sap. In this way, the markets hover in historical imagination, solid in their importance, elusive in their physical remain. To reconstruct them is to piece together fragments, much like trying to catch fish with a net full of holes. Yet enough slips through to paint a picture of vibrancy, and when one reflects on Angkor as a whole, there's something fitting about this. The grandeur we see today, the towers and carvings, was always supported by something more ephemeral, less monumental, and far more ordinary. Floating markets did not aspire to eternity, yet they sustained eternity's builders. They remind us that history is not only carved in stone, but also whispered in water. To drift among those boats in imagination is to glimpse the real empire, hungry, practical, endlessly adapting. And as the story continues to slide forward, we begin to see how these markets, though everyday in nature, actually revealed the deeper paradox of Angkor itself, an empire both monumental and fragile, built of stone, yet dependent on tides that could never be fixed. For that paradox sat at the heart of Angkor's existence. The empire looked invincible in stone, yet it was always vulnerable in water. The floating markets illustrate this duality with quiet precision. They show us a society that could carve towers hundreds of feet high, yet relied on wooden canoes balanced precariously on currents. They show kings claiming divine status, while families bartered fermented fish paste for rice. Grandeur and fragility floated side by side. The water systems that enabled these markets were not simple ditches. They were engineered with remarkable foresight, channeling monsoon rains into vast borees and connecting canals. Imagine, if you can, a city the size of modern Los Angeles, threaded with waterways, each serving as both irrigation and highway. Boats carried rice from fields to markets, fish from nets to households, and timber from forests to construction sites. The floating markets were nodes in this network, pulsing with the flow of goods. Without them, the grid would have been useless. Storage without distribution. With them, Angkor became one of the largest cities of its age. At the center of this system was Tonle Sap, whose seasonal expansion and contraction dwarfed any human effort. In the wet season, it grew to cover thousands of square miles, swallowing forests and transforming villages into floating communities. Markets moved with the water, adjusting locations like nomads on rafts. In the dry season, the lake shrank, exposing land for planting and concentrating fish into smaller pools. The markets adapted again, compacting into tighter clusters. It was a choreography between people and flood, a seasonal dance no king could command. This dependency left Angkor perpetually negotiating with nature. The floating markets reflected abundance in good years, but in lean years they became stages for worry. Scarcity of fish meant sharper haggling, thinner baskets, and longer journeys to find enough to sell. Oral traditions hint at how families would rely more heavily on rice reserves during such times, stretching what they could. The market was the front line of this adjustment, a place where shortages became visible long before they reached palace halls. One could read the empire's health by counting how many boats arrived at market on a given day. Religion provided comfort in these fluctuations. Festivals often coincided with the turning of the river's flow, when the Tonle Sap changed direction. This event was treated almost as a divine performance, reaffirming that the cosmic order still held. In Pham Thai, the water festival, or Bon Nom Tuk, celebrates this reversal with boat races. Its roots stretch back to Angkor, when floating markets would have been flooded with both goods and ritual energy. Buying fish during such festivals was not merely practical, but infused with meaning. The river's reversal symbolized renewal, and markets echoed that optimism with an explosion of trade. But optimism could not always hide vulnerability. Archaeological studies suggest that by the 14th century, climate instability placed immense strain on Angkor's water network. Periods of drought baked canals into cracked beds, while sudden floods tore through embankments. The floating markets must have felt these shifts immediately. Boats that once glided smoothly may have been stranded in mud or battered by surging currents. For ordinary families, this was not abstract climate change. It was the difference between full baskets and empty ones. The empire's fragility was written most clearly in the struggles of its floating commerce. What fascinates modern historians is how these markets reveal the lives of common people. Otherwise invisible in Angkor's grand narrative, temples immortalize kings and gods. Inscriptions praise officials. But the floating markets whisper about women selling vegetables, children learning to paddle, and fishermen bargaining over nets. They show us a society not of stone and ceremonies, but of daily negotiations. It is easy to forget that the builders of Angkor Wat needed breakfast before they picked up chisels, and that breakfast likely came through a floating market. Women, in particular, occupied a visible role in this commerce. Accounts suggest they dominated small-scale trading, rowing boats heavy with produce or fish, calling out prices in measured tones. Their labor supported households and shaped social connections. In a world where elite women lived secluded, market women moved with remarkable freedom, steering their own vessels across canals. This visibility gave them influence. Even if history chose not to carve their names in stone, the floating market was, in its quiet way, a stage for female agency within a male-dominated hierarchy. The range of goods on offer extended beyond the basics. Alongside fish and rice, one might find palm sugar molded into cakes, betel leaves wrapped with areca nut for chewing, medicinal herbs tied in bundles, and woven baskets, sturdy enough to carry everything home. For wealthier buyers, imported luxuries appeared: Chinese ceramics, Indian textiles, perhaps even spices from distant islands. These luxuries floated alongside everyday necessities, making the markets a spectrum of the empire's economy in miniature. To walk, or rather to row through a floating market, was to browse an entire civilization condensed into a watery corridor. Foreign traders added another layer. Cham merchants from the east, Malay sailors from the south, and Chinese envoys from the north all encountered Khmer markets. They brought goods, but also ideas, religious practices, artistic motifs, and even culinary tastes seeped into Khmer life through these exchanges. The markets thus acted as cultural membranes, filtering outside influences into daily routine. A Chinese pot might become a family heirloom, or a Malay spice might slip into local cooking. These shifts rarely left records, but they shaped Khmer culture in subtle, lasting ways. The floating markets also remind us of the limits of central control. Kings taxed trade, but they could never fully command these watery bazaars. The markets thrived on informality, on the trust and negotiation between individuals. They operated beyond stone walls and royal decrees, adapting to currents more than commands. In this sense, they represented a form of decentralized resilience. When dynasties faltered, the markets did not. They belonged to the people, not the crown. In reflecting on all this, one begins to see Angkor less as a monument city and more as a water city. Its essence lay not only in towers, but in tides, not only in causeways, but in canoes. The floating markets, ephemeral though they were, embody this truth. They remind us that while empires dream of eternity, it is the adaptable, the floating, the humble that often endure. And so, as the story drifts onward, the picture of Angkor becomes less rigid and more fluid. A civilization built not just on sandstone but on rippling water, boats nudging gently against one another, carrying the lifeblood of a people. Which is why, when we picture Angkor only as a stone kingdom, we miss its most essential truth. It was a civilization that rose and fell on water. The floating markets offer us one of the clearest windows into this reality, because they embodied both the abundance and the fragility of Khmer life. They were not glamorous, not monumental, but they carried the empire's daily pulse. To appreciate this, consider how central rice was to everything. The Khmer grew rice in extraordinary quantities, thanks to their irrigation system. But rice did not move itself. Harvests from distant fields had to be transported, and here the floating markets became crucial. Farmers brought surplus rice by boat to sell or trade. In exchange, they obtained fish, salt, or tools. These exchanges kept villages supplied and allowed the state to collect its share. The floating market was where agriculture turned into economy. Without it, rice remained local. With it, rice fed the city of Angkor itself, along with its armies and priests. The fish trade was no less important. Tonle Sap produced astonishing quantities of freshwater fish, among the richest lakes in the world. Villagers caught them in nets, traps, and lines, often pulling in more than families could eat. Preservation became the key, and here Prahok entered the story again. Fish were salted, fermented, or dried, then loaded into boats headed for markets. There, families from rice-growing villages traded their grain for fish paste, ensuring protein in their diet year-round. This circulation was the quiet triumph of Khmer logistics. One village's abundance balanced another's lack, all mediated by floating exchange. Floating markets also helped to blur the lines between village and city. Angkor itself was a vast sprawl, with neighborhoods, temples, and reservoirs spread across dozens of square miles. Villages dotted the periphery, linked by canals. The floating markets connected them all. A villager who had never stepped inside Angkor Wat might still feel part of the great city, because her boat carried goods to someone who lived near its towers. In this way, the markets stitched together a population of perhaps hundreds of thousands, creating a shared economy, even without direct contact with the court. The rhythm of the market must have felt strangely timeless. Boats bumping softly, voices haggling, children leaning over edges to play with the water. Yet, within this ordinariness, subtle changes carried meaning. A new kind of ceramic from China hinted at distant trade connections. A scarcity of fish revealed a poor flood season. A rising number of soldiers buying supplies could signal upcoming campaigns. In this way, the floating market was a barometer of both local life and imperial ambition. Those who rowed their boats daily may not have thought of themselves as participants in history, but their transactions silently shaped the fate of Angkor. The floating nature of these markets also meant they could flex around obstacles. If one canal silted up, traders shifted to another. If floods covered land, boats moved to higher ground. This flexibility contrasts with the rigidity of temples and stone. Angkor Wat could not move, but a floating market could relocate overnight. In the long view, this is why the markets endured even after the empire declined. They were adaptable by design, because water demanded it, and yet that same adaptability also exposed their vulnerability. The canal clogged not only delayed boats, but reduced trade. A bad flood season starved markets of fish. Disease outbreaks, malaria, cholera, would ripple quickly through crowded boat gatherings. Floating markets, for all their vitality, were always fragile. They floated not only literally, but metaphorically, balanced between plenty and scarcity. Foreigners must have found this fragility intriguing. To Zhou Daguan, accustomed to cities with paved streets, the sight of a market that dissolved and reformed with the tides may have seemed chaotic. But for the Khmer, it was simply natural. Streets crumbled in rain, canals never did. What looked precarious to outsiders was, to locals, reliable. This difference in perspective reveals how deeply environment shapes perception. Where land people see danger, water people see routine. Another quiet dimension of the floating market was education. Children learned not in classrooms but by helping in boats. They learned to paddle, to balance, to recognize the right price for a bundle of herbs. They learned stories from elders and gossip from customers. In this way, markets served as informal schools, transmitting knowledge generation after generation. They ensured not only food security, but cultural continuity. As Angkor declined, floating markets kept going. They survived invasions, droughts, and political collapse. When the capital shifted south, the markets followed the people, not the kings. This endurance tells us something profound. What lasts in history is often not the monumental, but the mundane. The markets floated past the fall of empires, carrying fish and rice as steadily as ever. And as we drift further into this watery story, the picture grows clearer. Angkor's true foundations were not carved in sandstone, but rode on currents. The floating markets, in all their impermanence, reveal the steady resilience of people who lived not for eternity, but for today, tomorrow, and the next tide, which is perhaps why they hold such fascination today. In a world where history so often celebrates what is fixed, the floating markets remind us of what is fleeting yet vital. Their ephemerality did not diminish their importance. On the contrary, it was their impermanence that allowed them to survive across centuries, adjusting to each shift of river and empire. The floating markets also carried with them a subtle artistry. Boats themselves were crafted from local timbers, often lightweight yet strong, designed to skim across shallow canals. The curve of a prow, the polish of oiled wood, the creak of a bamboo paddle, each was both practical and aesthetic. Families sometimes decorated their boats with carved motifs or painted symbols meant to ward off bad luck. In this way, even a humble market canoe could express cultural identity. It was art in motion, drifting among Khmer. Markets also doubled as stages for performance. Musicians with simple instruments, drums, flutes, or stringed fiddles, sometimes played as boats clustered. Their music floated across the water, mingling with shouts of vendors. Dancers, too, occasionally performed during festivals, their movements reflecting both courtly tradition and village improvisation. The floating market was therefore not only economic, but cultural, a gathering where entertainment and exchange interwove. It was daily life infused with theatre, though a quiet, unpretentious sort. Socially, markets functioned as bridges between communities. Villages, scattered around reservoirs or rivers, rarely interacted directly, but the market drew them together. Kinship ties expanded through repeated encounters at these gatherings. Marriages were arranged, disputes were negotiated, and alliances were reinforced. The water carried not only goods, but relationships. Families who met regularly across boats grew intertwined, creating networks that extended beyond geography. If temples anchored divine order, markets anchored social fabric. The political role of floating markets, while subtle, was undeniable. Officials may have monitored them for taxation, ensuring a share of trade reached the crown. Yet the very nature of markets made them resistant to complete control. They were too fluid, too shifting, to be fully fixed under state authority. A ruler might decree tax collection, but a boat could slip into another canal, trading discreetly. This looseness provided ordinary people a degree of autonomy within the empire. They could adapt, negotiate, and sometimes evade, keeping local agency alive under imperial shadow. Disease and health, too, played into the story. Where people gathered, illness followed, and floating markets were no exception. Yet the water itself offered remedies. Herbalists sold plants with medicinal properties. Healers traveled by boat offering treatments, and rituals to cleanse or protect were performed at market edges. These practices remind us that floating markets were not only places of commerce, but hubs of survival. They distributed not just food, but knowledge, hope, and comfort in times of need. Over time, the decline of Angkor's great hydraulic network made floating markets even more critical. As reservoirs silted and canals clogged, local trade adapted. Smaller, more flexible markets filled the gaps left by grand infrastructure. Families no longer relied on imperial order, but on their own ingenuity. In this way, the markets cushioned decline, softening the collapse of centralized power. While palaces decayed, boats kept moving, keeping people afloat, literally and figuratively. This continuity extends into the present. Modern visitors to Tonle Sap marvel at floating villages where houses rest on rafts or stilts, and markets still cluster on boats. Children paddle canoes to school. Vendors row through neighborhoods selling vegetables or fuel. In these sites, one glimpses the persistence of an ancient rhythm. The forms may have changed: plastic buckets replacing clay pots, diesel engines replacing paddles, but the essence is the same. Life remains tethered to water, and markets remain its beating heart. The irony, of course, is that while floating markets shaped survival, they rarely entered the historical spotlight. Chronicles praised kings, envoys described palaces, and archaeologists measured temples. The floating markets, being transient, slipped between records, yet their invisibility is deceptive. They mattered more than many remembered monuments. After all, what use is a grand temple if the builders go hungry? Floating markets fed the hands that carved eternity, and as one imagines the sun setting over Angkor, the towers glowing gold, it is easy to picture boats drifting back to villages after a day of trade. Goods exchanged, gossip shared, children dozing in canoes. This was the real conclusion of Angkor's daily drama, not ceremonies in stone, but quiet returns on water. The floating markets framed the rhythm of life, day after day, tide after tide. The story of Angkor, then, is not only the story of kings and gods. It is the story of boats nudging side by side, of fish exchanged for rice, of lives sustained by currents. It is the story of impermanence outlasting permanence. And as we continue, we find that the floating markets, while humble, reveal the deepest truth of the Khmer, that survival, community, and culture are never carved once for eternity, but constantly renewed, like ripples on a lake that never stills, a truth that has floated forward into our own time. The persistence of floating markets tells us that the Khmer way of life was not an exception of history, but part of a continuum of human adaptation to watery landscapes. Where rivers dominate, people turn rivers into roads. Where floods overwhelm, people learn to float rather than fight. Consider the market as a kind of mirror of Angkor itself. On the surface, it looked fragile, boats bumping against one another, voices rising and falling, goods scattered in precarious piles. Yet beneath that fragility was a remarkable resilience. The very fluidity that made the markets seem temporary was what allowed them to endure for centuries. When the empire's temples were abandoned to the jungle, floating markets still rose with the tides. When dynasties collapsed, boats kept trading. It is a gentle reminder that permanence is not always the secret to survival. Sometimes impermanence is. Daily life, at these markets must have been textured with repetition. Families likely rode to the same spots, tied their boats together in familiar knots, and exchanged greetings before bargaining began. There was comfort in this routine, even as the goods themselves varied with the season. In the wet months, fish overflowed the baskets. In the dry months, rice dominated the exchange. People could measure time by what appeared at market. Children grew up watching these cycles, learning to anticipate which foods would arrive, and learning how to read the flood as a kind of calendar written in water. In the cultural imagination of the Khmer, water was never neutral. It symbolized fertility, prosperity, and cosmic balance. To gather at a floating market was to participate in this larger order, even if unconsciously. Buying a basket of vegetables was also, in its own way, an acknowledgement of dependence on the flood. When monks passed through for alms, they brought the sacred dimension into the market, reminding everyone that daily trade and spiritual merit were not separate. The floating market, therefore, was both practical and metaphysical, a point where economy met belief. The role of women here deserves quiet emphasis. It is not difficult to picture a woman balancing gracefully in her canoe, children nestled beside her, piles of produce arranged neatly. She might row for hours to reach a good spot, then spend the day negotiating with customers, her voice steady and measured. In these spaces, women were the anchors of exchange. They brought stability, reliability, and a sense of trust that kept markets functioning. In a society that celebrated kings and generals, it was women traders who kept food moving and families fed. Their names may not appear on inscriptions, but their labor rippled through the entire empire. Floating markets also encouraged an economy of trust. Boats were small, goods perishable, and transactions quick. Haggling was expected, but outright cheating could ruin reputations fast. In small, interconnected communities, trust mattered more than contracts. A fair trader gained loyal customers. A dishonest one found fewer boats tying up beside hers. This informal regulation kept markets balanced. It was a quiet justice system, enforced not by decrees but by collective memory and the natural spread of gossip. Foreigners, too, left their imprint. Traders from China, India, and the Malay world added their wares and their habits to the mix. Perhaps a boat selling rice would be moored beside one offering ceramics or woven cloth from abroad. These juxtapositions shaped Khmer tastes over time. Imported goods mingled with local ones, creating new patterns of consumption. Yet the markets remained fundamentally Khmer, rooted in water, in fish, in rice. Foreign luxuries drifted through, but the foundations never shifted. As Angkor waned, floating markets preserved continuity in a world of upheaval. They provided a steady rhythm amid decline. The canals may have clogged, the barrays may have dried, but boats still gathered wherever water allowed. For the ordinary people of the 15th century, the empire's fall was likely less dramatic than later histories suggest. Kings disappeared, but fish still needed salting, rice still needed trading, and children still needed feeding. Life flowed on through the markets, less spectacular but more enduring. Even today, the floating villages of Tonle Sap preserve a faint echo of that world. Wooden houses rise on stilts above the waterline. Boats slip between them carrying fruits, gasoline, or school children. Visitors who arrive often see these villages as curiosities, picturesque remnants of a distant past. But for locals, they are simply home. The markets still function as they did centuries ago, connecting lives through exchange. In this way, modern Cambodia remains tethered to Angkor, not by stone towers, but by waterborne trade. And as the story drifts closer to its end, it becomes clear that the floating markets reveal the true character of the Khmer world: adaptable, resilient, endlessly tied to water. Stone towers crumble, inscriptions fade, dynasties vanish, but the quiet commerce of boats on rivers persists, a soft, unbroken current running through centuries, carrying not only goods, but memory itself, memory that flows less like a carved inscription and more like a stream, winding and renewing itself with each generation. The floating markets embody that kind of memory, never fixed in stone, never grand, but always present, always returning with the tide. They tell us that Angkor was not simply a kingdom of monuments, but a kingdom of rhythms, lived daily in boats rocking gently on water. As the centuries rolled forward, colonial observers would describe these markets with an air of fascination, often remarking on their quaintness. To them, the sight of families living entirely on boats seemed curious, perhaps even backward, yet they missed the deeper truth that this way of life had already sustained countless generations, long before their notebooks arrived, and would continue long after. The floating market was not a relic, it was an adaptation. Its resilience came not from resisting change, but from drifting with it, adjusting shape whenever the water demanded. This adaptability is what ties the Khmer experience to the broader human story. Across the world, wherever rivers and lakes dominate, similar markets arise. The Mekong Delta, the backwaters of Kerala, the canals of Bangkok, all carry echoes of the same principle. People meet where water meets, goods travel where paddles or engines can push them, communities gather where the tide allows. What we see in Angkor's floating markets is not only Khmer ingenuity, but a universal human rhythm, survival by floating together. And yet, there remains something uniquely Angkorian about these markets. They were not peripheral, not afterthoughts. They were integral to one of the largest urban centers of the medieval world. They supported the building of Angkor Wat, the reigns of god-kings, the rituals of cosmology. They fed armies, linked villages, and carried foreign luxuries into Khmer hands. Without them, the grandeur of Angkor could not have existed. They were the quiet scaffolding of empire, never celebrated, never monumental, but always essential. When we imagine those markets today, we must picture them not as quaint postcards, but as living arteries, boats crowding together, the smell of grilled fish thick in the air, voices rising and falling like waves, monks accepting offerings, children clambering along wooden planks, women rowing with practiced strength. The market was not a spectacle, it was life itself, repeated endlessly until it seemed as natural as the water that carried it. Perhaps that is why, even in their transience, floating markets feel eternal. They embody a truth about civilizations, that beneath the monuments and dynasties, it is the ordinary exchanges, the food, the trade, the gossip that sustain everything else. Angkor's towers may symbolize ambition, but its markets symbolize survival. And survival is always the more enduring story. So the floating markets of the Khmer remind us, gently, of what history often forgets, that greatness is not only measured in temples reaching for the sky, but in boats nudging side by side, baskets of rice passing from one hand to another. That empires may vanish, but the need to trade, to feed, to gather, flows on without end, and that the quietest currents, the most unassuming rhythms, are often the ones that last the longest. And so, dear wanderers, our tale comes to a close. Until next time, may your night be quiet and your dreams be kind. Good night.